Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma 221 here, back in today, talk about Weekly Shonen Jump issue number 43 of 2024. And I honestly am very conflicted on what to feel about this week of manga in Shonen Jump. Of course, there were a lot of really good chapters this week. I mean, I really feel like the chapters that were on their peak were really extremely good. Like to mention Undead Unluck, as we'll get into talking about today, Kagurabachi. I even feel that some of the other chapters, like Ultimate Exorcist, Kiyoshi, Akane-banashi, like normal Blue Box, a lot of these chapters were on a really high peak this week. But at the same time, there were a lot of chapters that didn't quite do it for me like manga chapters have done in the past. So that's why I'm very conflicted on this week, because while there was a lot of really excellent good manga stuff, at the same point, the series that were low, in the grand scheme of things, were pretty low. They weren't like the ultimate, like the best week of Shonen Jump I've ever read. But that doesn't mean like there's no reason not to talk about this issue of Jump, because I do think there is a genuine lot of good stuff. Now, the one thing about this issue of Jump is that we have a lot, and I mean a lot of series to talk about. I have 16 series to talk about today, which as long as I've been doing this series, of course, this is the second time I've come back with this series during the 2024 calendar year. But even still, there are a lot of chapters to talk about this week, so really, I don't see any reason to delay it any longer. Of course, if you guys don't know how this series works, pretty much, I talked about all of the Shonen Jump series I read every week on a weekly basis. This time, like I said, we have 16 series, including three new series, of course, Ichi the Witch, Hakutaku, and Shinobi Undercover, of course, chapters 3, 2, and 1 of those series, respectively. This is a little reason why there are so many series here, so I'm pretty sure I'm going to be dropping a few of these as we continue on. Yeah, and of course at the end of the video, what I do is I go through and rank all the chapters from worst to best, pretty much put out all my thoughts, and I'm like, alright, I think this chapter's worst, and this one's the best, and fill in everything in between, and then of course pick a MVP, or a character of the week, as who I thought was the most cool character. But with all of that out of the way, I don't see any reason why we don't need to go ahead and get started talking about manga. So let's start off with Undead Unluck, chapter number 223. This chapter's titled Ragnarok. So this chapter, of course, starts off where we ended off last time with, of course, Apocalypse just being like, open up all of the quests. As Fuko pretty much freaks out like, hey, why has it even been 3 months yet? Like, what's going on here? And that's a trope that we're going to be seeing a lot in this chapter, is Fuko really freaking out about all of the nitty-gritty stuff whenever it comes to what is happening here, not being prepared for all of this stuff, as we'll see a lot. So we pretty much see she's like, hey, it hasn't even been 3 months yet. And Andy points out this is probably time manipulation due to one of the master rules, who of course is Time, as he pretty much says that is the old geezer of the power group here, pretty much, right? And he also says that he sits in the 7th seat. Fuko is like, but why is he doing this? And Andy pretty much explains that the reason is very clear. They are scared of injustice manifesting in Julia, of course, so they are doing everything in their power to ensure that it doesn't activate whatsoever, even if it is a very unorthodox method, such as pretty much accelerating time so that doesn't happen, right? And then we see it, the quests for this round are all the remaining 8 of the Master Rules. Of course, the only ones that aren't around still are Beast and Language, who of course were neutralized like 2 arcs ago at this point. But we pretty much see that Sick is also part of this, even though Sick has been cleaved straight in half by Rip. It still looks like he has fighting potential inside of him. Fuko pretty much beats herself up like, I should have considered this, like, why wasn't I thinking, like, damn it, like, I should have thought about all of this. And as she's going through all of this, eventually, Apocalypse just opens up again like, alright, 1 month has passed, activating the penalty, Ragnarok. Because of course, the time UMA, has accelerated time once again to the point where all of this has happened. And at this point, Fuko is freaking out a massive amount. But as that happens, we cut over to another scene on the moon between Luna and Soul. As Luna is pretty much sitting here just sipping up on her teacup, right? As Soul pretty much appears and just says like, hey, what's the big idea here, Luna, right? Like, why won't you let us act? And Luna's like, oh, why you ask? What do you expect after being detained solely by undead? And as Soul pretty much like starts to form like a soul blade in his hand and jump up to strike Luna, Luna just says, alright, Soul, now return to being a part of him. I'll find that way more amusing. And Soul isn't just like, oh, I see. From the very start, you... Alright, well in that case... And that is all we see of this tiny scene here. As all of a sudden we cut back to the Union headquarters, of course, under Stonehenge there. As Nico finally, yells down to Fuko, hey, Fuko, the 10 superior rules have just ascended on Earth after ever being freed from Andy, but we suddenly spotted pillars of light coming from the locations where they landed. What is going on here? And we see all of these light locations pretty much spring up around the sun, where, of course, Soul, the sun, Soul is what people call the sun in certain sort of things, right? But the sun god, the god sun, is pretty much now also coming out of the sun. I know this makes perfect sense at every single point, but it seems like these pillars of light are almost helping dragging sun out of the actual sun itself, right? Luna pretty much says, hey, at long last, the time has finally come. You have all done a fine job. As she then says, hey, which is exactly why I want you to show me by overcoming him at his best. Of course, talking about Sun in this moment. And the implication here, I think, is that Luna sent Soul and all of the other rules back to Sun, as, of course, Luna said, hey, now return to being a part of him. That is sort of what makes the most sense to me into why they're sort of helping grab Sun out of the sun, right? But Luna continues just saying, hey, I want you to show me the true value of the rules that are unknown to me. Fuko is still absolutely freaking out over all of this, but eventually Andy comes in as a little bit of comic relief and sort of tickles her on her side to get Fuko, out of this deep, dark headspace. And he pretty much says, sheesh, Fuko, what are you freaking out for? All of those master rules are the ones that are freaking out right now, Those guys are up against the ropes, so they had to bust out this little secret cheat code of theirs, right? And Fuko, it is all due to the foundation that you have laid from Juiz's injustice from the past and us in the current union. That's what made them do this, so let's go, you bunch of lugs. And that is pretty much what Andy gets up to here, as we pretty much see that Sun is ascending onto the Earth right there around Stonehenge, of apparently where the final battle is getting ready to be held. As all of a sudden, we see that Sun unleashes a massive blast out from its face, and it almost gets ready to envelop the entire ground where Stonehenge is and everything around that. As all of a sudden, we see all of the negators from the Union are suddenly coming up out of the ground, and we see the fire blast that Sun pretty much makes come out of him, or the fire blast he fires, is deflected by Latla's Untruth, as she uses her to, affect her trajectory of it, right? As the final words of the chapter is just Luna saying, alright, negators, now let us begin. The final battle for the fate of this planet. Ragnarok. And that's where we end this Undead Unluck chapter. I really enjoy this chapter for a multitude of reasons. I really like seeing Fuko freak out after having all of this stuff happen here. And it makes sense that they were able to cheat time by being in there. So it also makes sense that UMA would be able to cheat time in there too. So it makes a lot of sense there, and also, the stuff between Soul and Luna is a little bit interesting. We don't know all of the context for this yet, but it seems to be pointing towards a bigger sort of threat in the end. Having Sun finally come down to attack the Union, another really cool moment, all the way till the very end of Ragnarok is beginning, and the Union is getting ready to do their best against it. The one problem with this chapter, I think, is maybe the pacing of it, being as it's last time I thought we were going to be finding Master Rules, but now it's already Ragnarok? What's going on here? I mean, we all knew that this arc was going to be ending with Ragnarok, but I don't think many of us expected it to happen as quick and at the acceleration that this has happened here. Not that it's a terrible problem, just a little bit of an interesting choice made by, of course, the artist and author, Yoshifumi Tezuka, so nothing bad, but just a little interesting. Well, with that, let's move on to One Piece chapter number 1127. This chapter is titled Adventure in the Land of Mystery. And, hey, this is the first true chapter of the Elbaf arc, being that, our characters are actually on, or seemingly on, Elbaf at this point. So, of course, the end of last chapter opened up with ended with Nami pretty much in some mysterious place. And we don't quite start off this chapter here. What we actually start off with is a bunch of giants talking about the country of Elbaf, and they pretty much mention that there's a fire going on in a forest out in the woods right now, and that the fire is slowly approaching Yggdrasil, the World Tree, and they make a note that, hey, if the fire reaches the World Tree, then our country is doomed and completely done for, and they make a note that they should report this to the Sun God. But nothing else is really known about any of this besides for that. And they also make a note that, like, hey, the reason all of this is happening is because the ear god collapsed. Supposedly a rabbit of some sort. Maybe that'll come up later. We'll see. So we open up on Nami in what is called the Big Stein Castle, as we see that she's being attacked by a bunch of giant bees coming towards her. Zeus comes out of her climb attack to help attack all of these bees to sort of keep Nami a little bit safe at this point. Nami's just like freaking out. She's like, hey, Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, I'll even settle for Usopp. Somebody please come and save me, right? She makes the note that she has also been changed into clothes that she'd not changed into herself. And as she's sort of walking around this castle trying to get her bearings, she suddenly hears Usopp's voice in the background. And as she goes and starts to run towards Usopp, she suddenly trips on the ground. As we see, the ground is pretty much made up like of a lot of little bumps, right? As we see that this castle is pretty much laid out of Lego bricks, which is a really cool aesthetic for Elbaf to have so far, right? We then see that Nami is attacked by a big hedgehog-type creature, and as she starts to freak out, the hedgehog starts to attack her, and she starts to run. She's able to dodge all of the Lego studs on the ground to run around a bit more to not completely trip on her ass. Eventually, she gets to a little bit of a balcony, and she sees Usopp on the ground floor of this balcony, so like a story down from where she is, and Usopp is being eaten by this giant cat creature, right? The hedgehog is still running towards Nami. Nami uses her climb attack to, of course, electrocute the hedgehog. The hedgehog pretty much gets electrocuted, and Nami, at the same time, falls off of this balcony. As she falls down to the balcony, the hedgehog also sort of jumps off and gets shocked, and then it falls down and electrocutes the big cat creature that is also attacking Usopp at the same time. Usopp and Nami are just, like, freaking out even more. They start to run out of the castle, and as they are running around, Nami brings us up to the point of, like, hey, do you know where we even are, Usopp? And Usopp's like, I have no clue. It's like, hey, last thing I remember is that we were getting drunk on the giant ship, and now we're here. And then Nami puts two and two together, like, oh, hey, maybe we're hallucinating because, of course, that giant who gave us that tonic last time told us it had some, what's it called? Some hallucination, or some hallucinatory powers, pretty much, right? Usopp is then like, oh, well, if this is just Usopp is like, hey, if this is just an hallucination, I'll just stand up to this creature, right? It's not an hallucination. Usopp gets the crap beat out of him, and both Nami and Usopp fall off the top of this massive tower onto the ground, right? They pretty much black out on the ground, and whenever Nami wakes up, Usopp is still completely passed out. We see that there is a big lion creature in front of him, sort of alluding to that the cat creature from earlier ate a lion zone fruit, so has now turned into a lion itself. A pretty cool little image there if you can see it, right? At this point, Nami is even more freaking out. She holds up Usopp's body as like a shield, and she's like, hey, I'm so sorry, Usopp, like, I don't want to do this to you, right? But at this point, our heroes arrive, as we see that Sanji, Zoro, and Luffy all arrive, as Zoro calls out a three-sword-style Black Rope Dragon strike, Luffy calls out Gear 4 Gum Gum Elephant Whip, and Sanji calls out Ifrit Jambe Epilo Twister. And they all pretty much beat the crap out of this massive lion-type creature. It completely passes out, falls to the ground, and turns back into a cat, showing that it had this Devil Fruit ability, right? And then Zoro, Sanji, and Luffy sort of all just banter with each other. Luffy mentions how he does not want to eat this creature, being that he's a little bit full after eating that roast rabbit earlier, implying that they took down that ear god that the giants were talking about earlier in the chapter. Of course, Zoro's just like, I mean, okay, Luffy, I mean, alright if you're fine with that. And then, of course, Sanji's going over to Nami like, Nami, you had me so worried, I'm so safe, you're happy, right? And Nami's like, oh, I'm so scared, poor Usopp is dead after that attack, and Usopp's alive on the ground. It's like, damn it, Nami, I'm not dead yet. He's like, I'm gonna remember what you did to me, I'm not gonna take this standing on my head, pretty much. And at this point, all of the characters are just like, just have a little bit of a conversation. Luffy just says like, hey, there's some huge other creatures around here too. If they taste good, it's worth the trouble to whip them up. Zoro says, like, hey, finding the sea in our ship comes first. We don't know how the rest of our crew is doing. And Sanji pretty much says, like, hey, speaking about food, what about the hive and all of the bees you knocked out? Like, hey, that's a respectable source of honey there. Like, we don't need to do all of this. As Nami pretty much just goes, like, hey, why are you guys all so comfortable here? Where are we right now? And this is where we end this chapter of One Piece. I really enjoyed this chapter for the fact that it was just a really fun chapter seeing Nami and Usopp get into some hijinks and eventually seeing our main characters come and save the day. As far as your Elbaf fit so far, I definitely like Sanji's the most. I think he's got like the coolest like armor and then like the sort of cape flowing out behind him and like the swords. I think Sanji's outfit looks really, really cool. But still, Zoro and the rest of them, they all do have some nice looking fits to them. But yeah, that is One Piece. I guess now we're going to move on to the Jujutsu Kaisen, chapter number 270. This chapter is titled, The End of the Dream. Now, the thing about this chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen is this chapter means a whole lot more to somebody who is deeply invested into the Jujutsu Kaisen series, which is not a person that I particularly am. So while I do think this is a fun chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen, it doesn't mean everything in the world to me, so I'm going to skip through a lot of the parts of this, or just like mention them really quickly, because I don't particularly find them very interesting, right? We start off with Megumi and presumably, I think maybe Shoko, who is the healer lady of the Jujutsu community, right? Like she uses her curse technique to heal people. I think that they are over at a grave bearing Megumi's sister, who, of course, like, what was her name? Tsukahime, maybe, or something like that. I think they're burying her. And as they're leaving, Megumi gets a call on the phone. We pretty much see that Urame and one of the other Jujutsu people are talking with the old rock and roll electric guitar guy about Tengen's barrier and stuff. Nothing really important going on here. The first scene that I really found interesting was Maki talking to both the sumo wrestler and the katana sorcerers, as she pretty much tells them that due to all of the stuff going on with the Colon game, Japan's going to be really weird from here on out, and she pretty much tells the sumo guy and the katana guy to go into the sealed off part of Tokyo where all the cursed spirits are to attack them, and just live out their days there if they don't want to get like confiscated or possibly killed by other Jujutsu sorcerers, being that they aren't like registered and all of that sort of deal, right? Katana guy's just like, hey, I'd get plenty of blade practice there. And the sumo guy's like, no, wrestling with cursed spirits is actually very boring, so I don't want to do that. So eventually Maki just says like, hey, do whatever you guys want to, but I'm done protecting you guys, so just go ahead and get lost. And as this happens, the sumo guy sort of just walks off into the distance, and Katana Dude just says like, hey Maki, make sure you come back for me whenever it's time for me to go. I'd love to face off against you one more time. And Maki's like, huh, sounds good. The next scene is Charles and the guy who's like his Shonen Jump editor. Charles does some stuff about making manga. It seems like he's doing a little bit better. Really all of the scene there. The next scene is probably my favorite of the chapter, as we see Takaba, who is sitting with his new comedy partner, who, just to sort of spoil it and get it out of the way, is somebody who looks like Geto. Because they have, like, they're in Geto's body, or Kenjaku. We don't know which one it is, because we can't see the actual face, but we also know that this is Geto's body, and it has his hair, and we don't know if it's Kenjaku or Geto. We don't really have the specifics there, but we see Takaba is talking with this guy, and Takaba pretty much says, like, hey, whatever, let's get on with it, you shouldn't say that too loudly, and he's like, let's get it on with it, and they pretty much just talk about, like, hey, let's not make sex jokes, and that's really the whole thing between them there. Takaba is probably my favorite Jujutsu Kaisen character because of all of his comedy stuff. It was just a really, really, really fun battle, so, yeah, it's cool to see these two characters possibly doing comedy in the future, though I am very interested on it, whether this is Geto or whether this is Kenjaku. We don't really know at this point, right? The one sorcerer guy who goes talks with a kid, I don't really understand this scene, but he says to the kid he's sorry, and then the kid runs away. And that's really all there is there. Higuruma, of course, has survived this battle and has his arm in a sling and everything, and is talking with one of the surviving heads of one of the big three families. I don't understand this conversation either. I don't care enough about Jujutsu Kaisen to really know all the details here. So we know that Higuruma's alive, and that's sort of how it is. we didn't get a small scene between Angel and Megami, as we pretty much see that Angel and the cursed mouth on her body pretty much says like, hey, there's nothing to be embarrassed about now. Being, of course, remembering all of the stuff that happened to Megami, being that Megami remembers everything that he did to Angel in the previous battle and all of that, right? Megami just says like, hey, I'll take responsibility for all of this, Angel. Like, hey, from now on, I will be your right arm. Of course, being that Angel really likes Megami, she just says like, oh, okay, when is the ceremony, right? And Megami's just like looking shocked, like, what are you talking about? Like, that's not what I meant. Like, I actually have a mission to go on, so I'm just gonna have like get going. So let's like talk later maybe. And of course, Angel's just like, oh no, I talked way too fast. Like, now I'm all flustered. Like, what's going on here? And then the final scene of the chapter is two people who we have never seen before in Jujutsu Kaisen, presumably a husband and wife. The wife comes back home to the house to find her husband sitting at the table, who has some weird big googly eyes on his forehead, presumably due to a curse of some kind. Of course, our team of Nobara, Megami, and Yuji are all called to deal with this curse, and pretty much it said that this is probably a cursed user who is making the female see this on the guy's face, being that the guy's face looks normal to the rest of everybody. And Yuji pretty much says like, hey, a cursed user stirring up trouble, that'll be a cinch for the three of us. And presumably next chapter, of which is of course the final chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen, is going to be all of these characters going around and solving up this cursed case and calling it a day. Yeah, that's really all there is to Jujutsu Kaisen. This is really a chapter you care about if you care about the series, and being that I don't know all the ins and outs of Jujutsu Kaisen, I don't know every little bit of the lore, I don't necessarily get all of this in the end, though I did like a select certain scenes. Like, I liked the little angel scene that they had with Megami, I liked the scene with, of course, Takaba, and I also liked the scene with the Katana Sumo and Maki guy. Like, I think all of that's pretty cool there. But yeah, that's Jujutsu Kaisen chapter number 270. Next up is, of course, Kagurabachi chapter number 50. If you guys want to hear my full thoughts on this chapter, I have a nearly 30-minute video on the channel talking about this chapter. You can search it up just on my channel, like Kagurabachi chapter number 50, or I will leave the Kagurabachi chapter reviews playlist in the description down below so you can go check out these videos, right? Of course, this is chapter number 50 called Interception. I'm going to go through this one a little quick so I can like give a few of my thoughts on it, but not like go through all of the expanded parts of it. So pretty much we see that Chihiro and Haruki talk on the train about stuff, and there's a whole running theme to this chapter about people blaming the others for being more of a hero than the other one is. Of course, Hirohiko and Chihiro had flown out of the train last time, so it's currently just Uruha and Haruki currently on the train. They are currently heading to Senkutsuji Temple, which is where Mr. Samura, another one of the blade wielders, is currently there, or contractors as they seem to be called in this chapter a little bit. On the train platform, we see there's two sorcerers who make this thing called a mandala that is pretty much made for faster transportation to a certain place. Uruha and Haruki get off the train and meet up with them at this mandala and pretty much instantly travel all the way to the Senkutsuji Temple. At Senkutsuji Temple, we meet the blind samurai guy who is, of course, smoking a cigarette and is blind while wearing glasses. He looks really cool. His name is Mr. Samurai because, of course, he is a samurai with no eyes, so there's no eye in samurai, so Samurai. Really, really funny joke there, and I do like it. They meet up with Samurai. We learn that Samurai is a little weird. We have a little bit of a flashback where Chihiro and Shiba used to go out whenever they first met Samura together, and a little bit, or the first time that Chihiro met Samura. Not really anything too important, just a little bit of a fun little note of the chapter, and it's a little bit of a cool thing. At that point, all of a sudden, the Kishaku forces suddenly come up on the Senkutsuji Temple, getting ready to attack. At this point, Haruki is whisked off into a treatment room where he'll get treated to his non-capability to be able to use his storehouse of power right now. And we pretty much learned that there's a time limit of 30 minutes until Haruki will be able to use the storehouse power to transfer Uruha and Samura's enchanted blades back to them. And pretty much the end of the chapter is Samura just being like, hey, I'll protect everybody here. Like, no worries, you'll have all the time in the world because I'm going to do my cool stuff here. And that's really where the chapter ends. This is a very good chapter of Kagurabachi. I do enjoy most of the things that happen in it. Chihiro, there's a really cool thing where he does not appear, which in chapter number 50, which is like a big milestone, a little bit of an interesting thing, and Samurai just seems like a really cool character going forward, so I can't really complain. This is a very good chapter of Kagurabachi. Next up is Ruri Dragon, chapter number 21. This chapter is titled, Nothing Wrong with Some Venom. Of course, Ruri Dragon is not a Shonen Jump series. It's currently a Shonen Jump V exclusive series, so only in the digital magazine. But being it's still a title of Shonen Jump, I include it in these videos because why not? I mean, why wouldn't I want to talk about all of these chapters of manga, right? But pretty much, of course, what happened last chapter in Ruri Dragon was, of course, at the end of last chapter, Meada was breaking off the horn off of course, Akoi's head, and pretty much it was like a big deal of like, oh no, why are they breaking off the horns? But at the beginning of this chapter, we learned that was pretty much a plan that Meada and Akoi came up with, pretty much just like saying like, hey, you want to break my horns? Like, yeah, if it's possible at all. And pretty much Meada says like, hey, the whole point is to spite all of those girls so you don't talk smack about your horns ever again. And she even says like, hey, plus, if it goes well, it'll sort of be a warning to everybody else who's watching to maybe not make fun of your horns in the grand scheme of things, right? And she just says, like, hey, this tactic should make it practically taboo to criticize your horns at all, so no more trouble will be stirred up, right? Of course, like, yeah, I mean, I understand your plan here, but do you think it's actually going to work? And Meada's like, hey, who knows, like, maybe Maimyu is a bit too ridiculous, but, she says, sorry I even suggest it, but Akoi's like, hey, screw it, let's just do it, Meada, right? Meada's like, are you actually serious about this? But Akoi just says, like, hey, you've already thought all of this through, and we need to do something, so yeah, let's get cracking at it. I think it's a good plan, right? And at this point, we see the two of them just give, like, a nice little smile to each other, as we suddenly cut back to the present, where, of course, one of Akoi's horns got broken off, and now Meada is working on breaking off the other one, right? And they're pretty much going around, a bunch of students are, like, screaming, like, no, don't do that, but others are, like, trying to help Meada. It's, like, a little bit of, like, a flip-flop between everything going on here. The two girls who were bullying, of course, Akoi last time, end up coming in and just, like, hey, ask what's going on. Pretty much the guy explains, like, hey, I'm kind of lost too. All of a sudden, like, Meada just stood up and, like, announced, like, hey, I'm going to be breaking, Akoi's horns. And everybody's like, what's going on? And, Meada just says, like, hey, she said the horns were always getting in the way, might as well snap them off since they're dangerous or something. And the bullying girl is just like, what in the hell? Like, what's actually going on here? Like, what's actually going on here? And as she walks over, she just says, like, hey, have you lost your mind, Meada? Like, what are you actually trying to accomplish here, right? And Meada's like, oh, are you also here to help too? And she just says, like, hey, why would I even want to help do this, right? But Meada just says, like, oh, come on, I'll even let you do the honors. As she says, like, hey, now this R1 is way tougher than we actually expected, so, are you cool with helping out? And Akoi says, like, yeah, I'm fine with, her helping out. Her name is actually, Kamata, so, a little bit of an interesting, Kamata's like, huh? Like, I don't know if I want to do this, right? But eventually we see that she eventually starts to help, and as they start to just break them off some more, they're not actually able to break it because the horn is, like, really tough, right? And all of this is happening, Kamata just asks her, just like, hey, Akoi, are you sure it's okay to break your horns? And she's like, hey, why are you asking me? Do you actually care about any of this, right? But at that point, they can't break Akoi's horn off, so they pretty much sit down on the ground and like, alright guys, let's take 5 here, let's take a break from breaking off some horns, right? And Kamata eventually asks, like, hey Akoi, are you guys doing this just to spite me in specific? And Akoi's just like, I don't know, who knows? And Kamata just says, like, hey, like, seriously, like, what's even the point of this? Like, I'm sure this can't feel really good to you, right? But Akoi just says, like, oh, hey, quit worrying. It's not like there's nerve endings or anything in there. It's pretty much just, like, bone that's coming out of my skull. Nothing bad at all, right? And she just says, like, hey, like, I felt the same way whenever they grew in that morning. Like, I know they're very dangerous and scary, like, and even very kind of freaky and gross. But I just want people to speak their minds, because do whatever I can to make this right. Like, sure, I've insulted folks behind their backs, and I'm the biggest fan of others. But still, I'd rather you come and talk to me. We can talk it out together, and we'll try to see eye to eye. After all, we're in the middle of planning this amazing event together, and I'm working my butt off to make it shine, right? And Okoi pretty much gets off and just talks to Kamada some more, saying like, hey, or maybe you'd rather stick to insulting others in your little echo chamber over there. Maybe those childish middle school-esque friendships are more your kind of thing, huh? And as they're pretty much going back and forth, Meada pretty much gets on into joking too. So they're just like slinging a whole bunch of words here at Kamada's expense. All of a sudden, a guy comes into the room with some heavy-duty bolt cutters, as he just says like, hey, I got what we need to break off the horn. And as they get ready to do this, they get ready to break it off, and they do it, and the horn snaps off in a very, very clean cut. Meada is almost too excited about this happening, like, oh my gosh, we already did it, it is totally off, right? The teacher then walks into the room to see all of this mess unfolding, and are completely freaking out about everything that's going on. And we see there in all of this, Okoi accidentally dropped onto a painting that was currently being made, so she's now covered in paint, and she's pretty much, her dress is all messed up and everything, right? Pretty much her and Meada are walking back home after all of this, and, Okoi's like, yeah, we sure got into huge trouble back there, and Meada says like, hey, well, that's a funny joke, I mean, your uniform was probably the biggest victim of all, right? And then she pretty much notes like, hey, anyway, your horns broke off real clean, and like, are you feeling okay after all of that? And Okoi's like, yeah, I'm feeling fine. They've got the horn fragments together, and there's like, hey, check it out, and like, Okoi's like, hey, throw all of those away, we don't need them. But she pretty much says like, hey, Okoi, you should keep one as a memento of this occasion, right? And eventually they're just like, hey, that blew up into such a huge deal, like a bigger event than was even planned there, right? And Okoi's like, yeah, I haven't had that kind of workout in a while. I'm going to be sore all over tomorrow. And we see the two of them are just laughing at each other and having a lot of fun talking about all of this stuff. A really nice moment to see both Meada and Okoi doing really well together here, right? At this point, they're talking a little bit more, and as they're pretty much going through it, they're just like, yeah, that was great, you sure let her have it, right? They're like, that awkward look on their faces earlier was completely priceless, like, nobody realizes already on the verge of breaking. I almost feel guilty for the way things worked out, all like that, right? And eventually, we pretty much, like, touch a little flashback where they had a phone call with, of course, Okoi's mom, and they say, like, hey, that's a fun idea, like, you guys should, have fun with it. And she pretty much says that new horns will grow on Ruri's head anyway, so there's no reason that they shouldn't have cut him off to begin with, right? And as the two of them are talking, pretty much Meada's like, hey, hopefully the next pair won't be so sharp and pointy as they were before. But Akora pretty much says like, hey, I wouldn't mind some cuter horns in the end, right? And pretty much the two of them just continue like, hey, Meada's like, hey, that was a long time coming. I finally got some revenge on some people, right? Okoi asked if they were friends before all of this, and Meada says like, I mean, yeah, but we never really got along too great, right? And Okoi starts to feel a little bit of bad about this, like, maybe I was too harsh back there, maybe that was, like, too far of a punishment to go for something as simple as that. But Meada just says, like, hey, I guess that can be true. Like, nobody's really the bad guy, not you or them either, but hey, there's nothing wrong with a little venom and a little spite, because even full-blooded humans are full of this stuff to begin with. And on those, like, little, like, nice words, that's where we end this chapter off of Ruri Dragon. I really love this chapter of Ruri Dragon, as it sort of gets the whole point across of, like, yeah, they dealt with Okoi's boiling here, the horns will grow back next time, and Okoi and Meada are getting super, super close together as time goes on. This was just an awesome chapter, and I can't say anything bad about it. Honestly, this may be my chapter of the week, being that I have not ranked them yet. Just an amazing chapter, all things considered. Next up is Kill Blue, chapter number 70. This chapter is titled Shin Kozami vs. Jinta Tomeki. It is completely what it sounds like. The two of them just go back and forth, trading blows. We pretty much learned that Jinta has this martial arts background, and he has never lost a battle. Like, his biggest strikes come in the form of blocks, almost, as he wears, like, those metal wristbands around his arms, right? Shin is able to get behind him and grab one of the weapons for this whole battle thing. He grabs a weapon, but Jinta's like, oh, why are you using that? Pretty much, if my chapter will load here, sorry. If I remember correct, it's not loading too well, but as far as I remember, Shin pretty much tries to hit Jinta with the weapon. Jinta blocks it using his, like, special abilities and all of that stuff. Do I have the chapter now? Yeah, look at that. He blocks it with all the special stuff. The shear absolutely shatters, and Jinta puts a full blow punch into Shin. Shin is barely able to block it, and he pretty much says, like, hey, if I don't block this attack, I may actually just, like, die straight out, right? Shin gets into his martial art style and goes to attack Jinta some more. Jinta is hit by a few of them, like, damn, these strikes hit really hard, but still, this isn't a real attack at me. And as he's sort of letting his guard down, Shin uses his Tensen Rasenko attack as Jinta uses his explosive reactive armor Black Edge block, and they both use their signature attacks, and at the end of it, Shin's attack is able to make it through and shatter one of the arm braces that, what's this called, had. One of Jinta's arm braces, and then it crumbles to the ground as Jinta's like, damn it, you little shit! And Shin's just like, hey, it looks like you barely blocked that. Like, how lucky for you there wasn't a hole in your chest. I don't care about Shin. I don't care about this fight. I don't barely care about this series. That's why I went through this chapter quick, because it's literally just a fight where Shin ends up doing something really cool. Next time we may see a bit more of this fight, or we'll see more stuff between Otagami and, of course, the smart horse guy he's fighting. It's really all there is to it here. Alright, next up is Ichi the Witch, chapter number 3, also known as the third hunt, titled Raiko Magik. I really loved, like, how magic is spelled for K in this series, so, like, it makes me want to, like, add that flair of, like, magic to it. It just sounds really, really cool. But this is actually going to be the first time I'm talking about Ichi the Witch on the channel, due to the very obvious fact of the last Weekly Shonen Jump video I did was 4 issues ago, while this one is, well, Ichi the Witch has only been around for 3 issues, so last issue, Ichi the Witch started the next issue after last time I did one of these reviews, so I actually haven't talked about Ichi the Witch yet. But this is a very, sort of the first regular form chapter of Ichi the Witch that I feel like we're going to get, as of course we start up again on Mount Barokin, where of course the entire mountain where all of this series has gone down so far. As we see that there's like some bird flying up in the sky, and all of a sudden it pretty much explodes in like electrical energy as it falls down to the ground from this big wolf-looking creature, who we later learn is the Raiko Magik. So we pretty much learn that the Raiko Magik is a lightning magic in this world of Ichi the Witch, and pretty much Raiko Magik just talks to itself, and like, it's talking about like how cartoonishly evil it is, almost like, it has been 2 weeks since I manifested in this world. I've frightened just about every animal in this surrounding area, and so far, no witches have come and tried to acquire me. He's like, there should be a human village some miles from here, and I think it's time I was on my way to fry some humans, right? So he pretty much just Raiko Magik just goes through talking about all of this sort of stuff. Like, we understand how this magic was created, is that it says that it is the flames that are sparked from lightning, and it became an electric current that surges through the body, boiling a creature's blood and cooking them from the inside. So while this magic has like a regular, like, corporeal form, it is also like one of these majestic, like, mystical animals too. It's a very, very easy thing. We pretty much learned that the Raiko Magik pretty much just wants to be one of the strongest magics of ever, and especially wants to be the strongest lightning magic out there, right? So it pretty much just thinks about all of this and like how it just wants humans to like subject itself to it and never be able to fall to it, pretty much, right? And all of a sudden, as the magic is starting to walk towards this human village, it's walking through the woods, and all of a sudden, it notices something in its peripheral vision, right? But as it turns to see what it is, it doesn't see what this thing is. But in the manga, we were able to see that it's actually Ichi who is there, pretty much with some rope in his hand, obviously stoking out and like finding or scouting and finding something to do with this Raiko Magik here, right? The Raiko Magik pretty much like turns around like, oh, I just must have imagined it, no bother, as it like continues to move on. But as it starts to move on, all of a sudden it realizes that the orb in the center of its chest has a little bit of a smudge on it. Well, the Raiko Magik is just like, oops, my heart jewel got smudged. As we get a little bit of like a narration pretty much going like, hey, the trial for acquiring the Raiko Magik is to steal the heart jewel on its chest without being struck by its lightning even once. And the Raiko Magik pretty much just thinks like, hey, I think that is a very cruel trial if I do say so myself, right? Well, the Raiko Magik continues to walk along, but suddenly sees another thing in its peripheral vision. Again, this time it is Ichi, who is hanging from the tree with his legs, like, tied up on top of it, right? And the Raiko Magik's like, man, I'm just getting way too worked up about all this. Like, I should just calm down. As all of a sudden, it hears some singing off in the background. As the Raiko Magik starts to walk towards this cliff, and off the edge of the cliff, we see that there's a little clearing with a bunch of flowers in the middle of it, where nobody else is sitting other than Desikaris, who of course is the witch that we have been the most prolific through this entire series, pretty much the one who's escorting Ichi around this entire time, right? Well, the Raiko Magik just sees this as like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I have a chance to do a test fry on a human before I get to this human village. Like, I can't wait. As the Raiko Magik starts to run, starts to go, and it pounces up through the air, over the cliff all of a sudden, down towards where Desikaris is. And as it's leaping there, it just like thinks like, give me a good look at your face as you tremble in abject terror, as I, the dreaded Raiko, deliver onto your doom. But as the Raiko Magik goes and do this, all of a sudden, Ichi jumps down from a tree, and we see that Ichi has pretty much just made a massive snare to catch the Raiko Magik in. And that's what you see, is that if I could speak, and that's what we see Ichi do here in this next pretty much like 2-page spread. It's not like a full 2-page spread, but it's like an action shot of like the Raiko Magik getting caught and then Ichi pulling down the snare, which does completely catch the Raiko Magik. It's a really, really cool image, and I really like how Ichi looks here as he goes down and pretty much pulls on the string or pulls on the rope and makes the snare pretty much tighten up, right? And then we see that Ichi reaches down to his side, grabs a cloth that is filled with some sort of substance, and slings it on the face of the Raiko Magik, and the Raiko Magik pretty much just completely passes out onto the ground, right? Whenever the Raiko Magik wakes up, though, we see that Ichi is going around and is just like, oh, look at this, so this thing is actually a magic. Like, it's surprisingly light for its massive size, right? And we pretty much just see that Desikaris and Ichi go a little bit of like a back and forth to it, as they pretty much just talk and like, hey, normally this would have been a magic-infused trap, but normally it's not enough to hold something like this. That doesn't really matter too much. What really matters here is that as Ichi's getting ready to go to, and it's like, alright, so you know what, we've caught this animal, so it's time to now butcher it. And Uro, who of course is, I think his name is, Uro, who is the magic that Ichi acquired in the first chapter, pretty much the very strong, like, doom magic wielder or whatever it is, the big bad magic, pretty much on Ichi's shoulder, just as like, no, you're not going to be butchering this thing, right? And Ichi's like, what are you talking about? And Uro pretty much just goes like, hey, this poor thing, I cannot bear to watch you, like, just desecrate its body like this. Like, what have you done to it already? Like, what's that rope around its neck? And Ichi pretty much says, yeah, it's like a new snare trap, right? And he pretty much just says, like, hey, pull this into Noose Titans. Yeah, he pretty much just made a noose. I called it a snare. I feel stupid now, but close enough. I think snares get, like, the same point across, too, I think, in the very end, right? Ichi pretty much explains that the Raiko Magik has taken the form of a fox, pretty much, and being that it is in a fox, it is a magic, it actually has the same sort of quirks that foxes have and all of that sort of stuff, and he pretty much says, like, hey, when foxes pounce on their prey, they really want to pounce to the northeast if possible, so put some bait in the Lord of Northeast there, and it's highly likely the fox will go for it, right? As we see that Desikaris was sitting in the northeast direction, wherever the fox or Raiko Magik pounced, and that's the snare trap got it, right? Desikaris pretty much just goes through and says, like, hey, plus I totally understand why the Raiko Magik couldn't, like, resist my completely feminine allure, right? And she's like, I'm so gorgeous and so delicate, like, it couldn't help but try to pounce on me, right? And of course, Ichi hearing all of this is like, elegant, delicate, like, I don't quite know if I agree with all of that, right? But eventually, Desikaris asks Ichi what the cloth he threw on its face was. Pretty much, he just says it's a fabric he soaked in wood vinegar. Foxes don't like its pungent smell, and this one seemed to have a very sharp nose, so it knocked it out completely, right? And Uro pretty much just points out how Ichi did this without magic. He did it with a complete logic-based approach to it, right? And pretty much Uroro was like, hey, you're supposed to, like, face off against the magic and do all of that sort of deal. Like, you're not supposed to just, like, use the logic to beat one. You're supposed to fight a magic with your own personal magic. Like, that is how this goes around here, right? Well, Ichi pretty much says, like, hey, it's whatever. Like, it's one of the basic tenets of hunting is the ambush, and we ambushed this thing pretty well, so I'd say my logic works. So why do I need to introduce myself to my prey and, like, go up and actually fight it, right? And Ichi pretty much just says, like, hey, this magic here killed other things for fun. It wasn't hungry, its life wasn't in danger, and it burned other creatures purely because it felt like it. That is not hunting, that is murder. And I have no problem toying with others, thus, it is no right to complain about others toying with it. So a very logical approach that Ichi gives here, and one that I really, really like, because as much as, like, Ichi's like, oh, he's a witch now, because Uroro couldn't be acquired by women, so I just really like this sort of twist that Ichi puts on this. Is like, hey, this thing killed, so I'm completely fine killing with it. It's like the golden rule. Wish unto others, or do unto others as you wish to be done unto you, or I think that's pretty much how it goes. But I really like how Ichi goes through and says this. I think it's pretty cool. Pretty much as Ichi pretty much just goes, like, stab it with a butcher's knife or whatever, Descross pretty much just tells him, like, hey, you don't need to butcher it, just cut up its heart jewel before it wakes up again. So Ichi pretty much takes off the heart jewel, and suddenly the Raiko Magik explodes and becomes a small little gem that Ichi can hold in his hands, right? And Ichi's like, hey, what is this sort of thing? And Descross pretty much explains that it is a magic stone. It's proof that you've acquired a magic, and you can use its magic by doing a chant at a certain point, right? And Ichi pretty much, or there's actually the chant inscribed on the crystal, and pretty much Descross tells Ichi not to say the chant just because it's just going to be easier if he does it, right? Descross also just makes a little mental note of, like, how Ichi actually went through and completely, like, stalked the Raiko Magik for, like, a few days just to figure out everything about it. So Ichi is different than the regular witches, something that we already know. All of a sudden, as Ichi and Descross start to head off somewhere, all of a sudden a mirror appears in front of them. So pretty much this woman on the other side of the mirror just says, like, hey, you have the young man if you correct right. Well, make sure you bring him without fail. We await you in the capital of Natali at the Mentinel Witches Association. So that is the next spot that our two protagonists are going, or at least our one main protagonist in Ichi, and who will probably be our deuteragonist in Descross, as it is seemed to go so far. So yeah, it's a really good chapter of Ichi the Witch. I really, really enjoyed this chapter, and I honestly just want to see more Ichi the Witch. Normally at this point it's been 3 chapters, so I would decide if I want to keep this series in or just toss it off to the side, but I'm really liking this series, so of course I'm going to keep on reading it into the future of however long this series goes on, which I think it's going to be going on for a pretty good long while. Next up is Shinobi Undercover Chapter 2. This chapter is titled Yodaka's Work. Of course, Shinobi Undercover is the second new series that started in this most recent batch. As, of course, the premise of the series is, oh no, there is a shinobi who has now been sent to protect this other young woman who is very clumsy, and he needs to do it undercover because he's a shinobi undercover. Who would have guessed due to the title there? So, pretty much, I'm not going to try to spend a whole long time on this chapter. It's pretty much a very simple chapter. Actually, I'm going to pause for a second because I do not remember the female lead's name, and I don't feel like talking about a Jump series where I cannot remember the female lead, so I will be back in a very brief second. Alright, female lead's name has been found. Her name is Oi Mukai. Being that I already talked about a series that has a Koi as the main character in it, of course, is Ruri Dragon. I'm just going to be calling her Mukai because I think that's a pretty simple thing I can remember. So, of course, Mukai is the main female lead of this series, and pretty much, of course, our main character, Yodaka, is also completely helpless when it comes to interaction. Pretty much, this chapter goes and follows just a basic plot of Yodaka's pretty much, like, complaining about, like, I don't know how I'm going to go through life, like, being friends with this girl and everything, because I don't know if I can actually handle it. The other major character in the series is actually Yodaka's operator, a very similar sort of thing to Kill Baloo's Nakoda, who is pretty much the person who is constantly in that series, Otogami's ear. Here, Yodaka has an operator who's always in his own ear, so we don't actually see this person's face at all, but that's just sort of how it goes. As Yodaka is walking through the hall, he suddenly runs into Mukai, who is pretty much covered in a bunch of leaves and stuff. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting this kid's name. Yodaka pretty much like, hey, what ended up happening to you? And she pretty much just says like, hey, I had a little brush of a bush back there, but hey, I am totally fine. Like, no need to worry about me. She's like, but I'm actually off to go to the nurse's office real quick, right? And Yodaka's like, so are you actually sure that you are fine? And as she's leaving, Mukai asks Yodaka if, hey, let's go eat lunch together, like in the yard or somewhere, right? And of course, hearing this, Yodaka's operator pretty much just says like, hey, this is your chance. You can deepen your bond with the assignment, so you should really go and do this, right? There's a few little jokes that go on with the chapter about how he's got to go eat lunch with the roommate. There's another little joke that also persists through this chapter where Yodaka's operator is just like really, really mean to Yodaka. Like, he's just like putting it down, and he just says like, hey, you can't disappoint anyone if no one has any interest in you to begin with. Like, besides, I bet you've never gotten to know anyone well enough to be able to disappoint them in the first place. So now stop being so conceited. Like, you don't need to worry about any of this. Like, his operator is just so rude to this kid for no reason. Like, it's honestly just funny how bad it is. Eventually, Yodaka starts to go out to the schoolyard where he's going to meet up and eat lunch with Mukai. As he's walking around, he runs into a group of thugs who pretty much go and just like knock the water out of, or act like Yodaka knocked the water out of their hand. Just like, damn it, dude, you made my water fall in my hand. And Yodaka's like, oh, I'm so sorry, like, I can buy you a new one, how much was it? And the kid's like, bro, it was like 30,000 yen, like, are you gonna be able to afford that? In American, like, exchange rates, that's almost close to $300, which is absolutely insane. Like, jeez, because I'm pretty sure, like, the going exchange rate is... Actually, let's play the game of what is the current exchange rate from yen to USD. Yen is actually down a whole lot right now. So let's see... 30,000 yen would be equivalent to 202 US dollars. Damn, the yen is actually very much down right now. I did not realize it was that low, but wow, it's a little interesting. But I'm not talking economy right now. I'm talking Shinobi Undercover, chapter number 2. So pretty much Yodaka's like, well, I can pay you back, but like, do you take installments, right? And all of the guys are like, oh, you're actually going to pay us? Pretty much, they're just like your typical shonen thugs who pull up in like your second or third chapter, just be complete and utter losers, pretty much, right? And as all of this is going on, Yodaka's pretty much just getting like bullied by these older kids, right? But at this point, the person whose name I have totally forgotten once again starts to appear. Let me leave this up next time. Oh, Mukai. I don't know why. I remember her name now. Mukai pretty much starts to walk this way towards where Yodaka and everybody is. And Yodaka pretty much just walks up and says like, hey, come on guys, cut that out. He's my friend there, right? And all of these guys start laughing like, oh, this little loser here's your friend, Mukai? Like, I can't even believe this. Like, you even looked at him like, why do you want to be friends with this embarrassment, right? But Mukai is pretty much like, oh, come on. He's not embarrassing. Like, actually, I think he's pretty funny, right? And all these thug, like, people just, like, start to be even worse. The one guy even comes over and smacks the lunch out of Yodaka's hands in front of her, right? And he's like, oops, I'm sorry, my hand slipped, when he, like, deliberately slapped it out of Yodaka's arms, pretty much, right? And everybody's like, dude, like, that's just cruel, like, what are you even trying to do here, right? And he's like, come on, dude, you're going way too far, those are just first years, like, come on now, right? But seeing this, Yodaka gets very upset and pretty much goes behind doing some, like, shinobi-type techniques and puts a hand on this older guy's shoulder. And the older guy suddenly gets, like, freaked out, like, when did this guy get behind me? Like, I didn't even notice it. And as he goes and, like, puts his hand, like, tries to shake it off of, or tries to shake Yodaka's hand off of his shoulder, he's like, why is this guy not budging? Like, what's going on here? And as he just continues to freak him out, right, all of a sudden, Yodaka's just like, hey, he pretty much talks to his operator saying like, hey, my mission is to become his friend for the assignment, which in that case, this is my duty as her friend to take care of this guy, right? He eventually lets his hand go off the guy's shoulder. The guy goes around and tries to swing, and he tries to swing. Yodaka acts very terrified and like, whoa, like, what are you doing? And as he goes and sort of like falls to the ground, he deliberately goes and does a leg sweep on this guy, pretty much sweeping with his leg, knocking this guy completely off balance, making him pretty much fall straight onto the ground. And as he falls straight onto the ground, his pants rip, showing his underwear, right? Everybody in the schoolyard starts to laugh at this guy, like, hey, that's what you get for picking on all the underclassmen for, like, yada, 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 right? Pretty much, Yodaka explains to his operator, like, hey, he used the tray from the center of the lunchbox, the little divider thing, to slice open the guy's underpants, so sort of how it is with him, and he's like, I wish I didn't have to do that, but it is sort of what it is. Mukai then comes over and is like, hey, are you okay, Yodaka? Yodaka's like, hey, I'm sorry all of this happened because of me, like, I'm super sorry about all of that. And Yodaka's like, hey, it's okay, the 5-second rule applies here, right? As she goes down and tries to pick up some of the onigiri she spilled on the ground from her lunchbox, and Yodaka pretty much just laughs a little bit with her. And Yodaka, while they're both on the ground, eventually turns to Mukai and just says, like, hey, Mukai, I want to be friends too. I mean, that's just the answer from your question yesterday, right? And Yodaka's like, oh, yeah, I mean, sure, of course, like, no problem with it there, right? And Yodaka pretty much thinks to, like, end off the chapter, like, hey, it's not about the mission anymore. I want to also get to know her. This was a really cute little chapter just going through of, like, the whole joke of, oh, man, Yodaka's, like, a total train wreck until eventually, Mukai's a total training wreck until Yodaka pretty much messes with these shonen thug bullies and eventually shows it to the older guy after a little bit of a confrontation in a really fun way of, like, acting scared, like, to not blow his cover in a way, and then just pulling off a really cool move on this bully guy. I also really like the art that we've seen in this series so far, so I really can't complain. It's the very end of the chapter, pretty much, it's the whole thing of, like, yeah, Yodaka and Mukai are going to become very good friends. It's a really nice little sentiment there, and like I said, the one part I didn't like about this chapter was the whole idea of the operator just being, like, a total asshole to Yodaka, but I still think this was a pretty cool chapter nonetheless. I definitely like Shinobi Undercover Chapter 2. Now, of course, I gave some very good praise to those other two series, of course, Shinobi Undercover and Ichi the Witch, but we need to finish off the serialization round with Hakutaku Chapter number 1. And if I have to say so, this is probably the least strong of all of the other series so far that have come out of this batch, right? Just to sum it up, because of course this is a 55-page chapter, and I don't have time to go through it beat for total beat. Pretty much our main character is, if I could find his name at any place, his name is Hikuma, and pretty much we learned that Hikuma is also, like, a nervous, neat shut-in in a way, like, sort of the same thing as Yodaka and, like, Kiyoshi from Ultimate Excess Kiyoshi, somebody who stays in his room a lot, and we pretty much learned that he is pretty much getting used by a lot of the kids at his school to do tasks when they want to go do stuff. They pretty much push it on to this kid, who, of course, is, if I could remember his name one more time, Hikuma. Like I said, first chapter, I don't always remember our main characters' names, right? Pretty much Hikuma has to go deliver something to this one teacher. This teacher is the main focus, or the main teacher that's focused on throughout the chapter. Pretty much Hikuma really likes his life going around and doing stuff. His full name is Dai Hikuma. He goes around, he pretty much makes a lot of mental games with the world around him, and pretty much just goes like, hey, I know this teacher's going to be here at this sort of time, but being that he's not there right now, there's a few certain places he could be. He just likes playing those mental games and stuff with him, right? We then meet the probably female lead of the series named Raika Noto. We pretty much learned that Raika likes to create video games and that sort of thing. At a certain point, Hikuma is in a class with the people who like to push on a bunch of work to him. They are in a school programming class where they need to make like a little bit of like a game jam sort of thing, where they need to make a small little like easy video game in like 3 weeks. There's an instruction booklet they can follow, but they don't particularly need to. Pretty much Hikuma groups up with all of the guys who pretty much shove all of the work onto him and just goof off the rest of the time, right? Hikuma pretty much just has to go around and have and pretty much do all of this work. And eventually Noto comes over to Hikuma and pretty much is like, hey, everybody else left around here, but you really seem to like making this game, so I can help you out. And pretty much they have this whole idea of like, hey, being that these kids are bullying you, why don't you like one-up them and show them someone else, right? And pretty much make a game on your own, and make a game so you're not going to do any of the work. You make the game yourself and make it really good so everybody will sort of look up to you and enjoy you, right? Pretty much that's just what they do. Pretty much Hikuma and Noto together make a little bit of a video game, a lot more of like a higher thing than what they would actually be doing in the grand scheme of things. And the very end of the chapter is about like, hey, the final reveal after all of the hard work and perseverance that Hikuma and Noto have gone through. At the very end of the day, everybody goes and plays the game that Hikuma played, and they're all like really, really liking it, right? And we see like the main character is the older teacher guy who's also this programming teacher. And at the very end of the day, everybody's like, hey, like, how does it even physically possible to make this in 3 weeks? And like the people in the group are like, we didn't actually do any of this, right? And eventually the whole thing gets pushed on like, oh, look at this. Hikuma made it, like, yeah, and the whole narration is just like, hey, everyone has a birthday, but without ever realizing himself, Hikuma was reborn as a game dev today, right? And pretty much he enjoyed it so much that he's probably going to be continuing to do it, and people are going to put him in the position that everybody wants him to make video games in the future. This was like a first chapter. Like, yes, I really like an idea of a manga about being like a game dev or something, but I don't know, it's just something about this first chapter didn't really hit for me in that same way. Like, whenever I think about series with like, it's not like a battle shonen, like an unorthodox sort of like sports series type approach of a manga or something, I really come to like 2 recent chapters in the or really 3 in the beginning of my mind here. Like, of course, in recent years, we've had Akane-banashi, which had this initial chapter of the whole idea of like, hey, Akane's dad is being expelled from the school, and that's the very end of the chapters now, Akane wanting to be a Rakugoka in his place, right? A very clear, like, goal from the first chapter, like, hey, here it is. But the first, like, 5 pages of this chapter don't really start off with game deving for our main character, unless you just go and, like, see the first 2 pages where Nono makes a game on the first page, right? Besides for that, it's just a little weird, like, there's no build-up in those initial pages. Like, I've recently in college, or at least while I was there, being that my college town is currently suspended right now due to the recent hurricane events of the world, I'm in a class, and our teacher pretty much says, like, hey, the way you can know if a movie does its job, if it sets up something the first 10 minutes, and then by the end of the movie, what is ever set up in those first 10 minutes has been solved, right? And in the way I look at this, like, in the first 10 pages, there's nothing really about any of this going on, right? Like, in the first 10 pages of My Hero Academia, it's, oh, yeah, this kid wants to be the greatest hero in the world. And what do they do? One Piece. Greatest pirate in the world, like Naruto, like greatest Hokage. Like, I know I'm going through these very obvious examples, but here, if we go through Ichi the Witch, you can tell what the plot is going to be from the very first page of the chapter, right? Same thing with what Shinobi Undercover is going to become, right? But just Hakutaku, I did not get the same sense of like, oh yeah, I decently enjoyed it out of this chapter. And that's really what it is. Also, I think we are really like reaching a point of where, man, these Shonen Jump MCs who, like, can't do anything for themselves because they're like, oh no, I can't talk to other people because I'm scared of them, right? At a certain point, like, I can't really stand it anymore. And the whole thing of, like, oh yeah, the guy who plays video games also, like, can't talk to people. I also don't quite know if I like that stereotype that it seems this series is going for. Not that I think it's bad. I'm going to give it at least 2 more chapters up to chapter 3 before I make a judgment if I'm going to continue to read it or not, but as of right now, those are my initial thoughts on the series. Next up is Astro Royale, chapter number 22. This chapter is titled Point Zero. Of course, last time all of our main characters met up with the sister of the Yotsurugi family, of course known as Ruri, being that she is a lawyer and is not going to be affiliated with the family. That is her alias name, pretty much. I don't know why I said alias. Yes, it is alias. That is how you say words at some point, right? Well, pretty much, Ruri pretty much says, like, hey, guys, are you all ready? And everybody's like, well, we know you told us about Point Zero, but, like, how are we actually supposed to get there? Like, it's in the middle of the ocean, isn't it? Like, we're going to take a boat or something. They walk up to the roof of the building, and we pretty much learn that Ruri knows how to fly a helicopter very well, and she is very good at a lot of things. She even says, like, yes, I can do anything, right? All of the gang hops into the helicopter, and Ruri pretty much explains to everybody, like, hey, Point Zero, located in Tokyo Bay, is a defunct oil rig plant owned by the Otsurugi family, right? And of course, Tarasu pretty much asks, like, hey, so what does this have to do with Tora's arrest? Like, why are we going to Point Zero, right? But Ruri pretty much explains, like, a week ago, Unit 6 contacted me. They said they want us to demolish Point Zero, even though it's been abandoned for 10 full years. It's obvious that Unit 6 is hiding something, and I'm certain that if we go to Point Zero, we will find out why Tarazu was arrested in the first place, right? They eventually get over to Point Zero, which, like they said, is this massive oil rig in the sea, and pretty much like, whoa, it's really huge, like, it's more like a floating fortress than a plant of some sorts, right? But as we look down on Point Zero, we suddenly see that almost half of it is destroyed, as there's like a massive, like, almost crater in the side of it, right? And Ruri makes a note of, like, hey, it looks destroyed, but it doesn't seem to be due to the massive disaster that recently rocked our world, right? This doesn't really make sense. It almost looks like human-made, right? And as everybody's looking down, they're just looking at it, and Kinpa sort of looks at it very interestingly, right? And we will understand about why that is by the end of the chapter, but just before we get there, as everybody gets down, like, everybody's like, whoa, look, the huge dome on that thing, like, shouldn't we check it out, right? But Ruri pretty much says, like, what is that thing up there? Like, it looks completely different than all of the documents I saw in the past. Like, there wasn't a structure at all like this here, right? Pretty much, Hibaru just is like, hey, how should we get inside here? But pretty much, while everybody is looking around, Kinpa just says, hey, we go this way, right? And Kinpa pretty much thinks, like, hey, I remember this place from my nightmares. As she pretty much almost seems to know where she's going exactly as she sort of walks down the stairs towards an entrance inside the Point Zero, right? And Karan, sort of seeing all of this as they walk inside the plant, goes like, hey, do any of you guys know what's up with Kinpa here? Like, she seems to be acting super, super weird, right? And Ruri just says, like, I mean, yeah, she's a lot more reckless than her father, Genji, but Hibaru just turns around and is like, well, yeah, of course. She's not Genji's biological daughter. And both Ruri and, of course, Karan, I'm sorry, I said that of course, I was trying to stall because I couldn't remember Karan's name there for a second. Both seem a little bit shocked by this, right? And, like, of course they didn't know. And Hibaru turns like, hey, you knew that, right, Tarasu? And Tarasu just says, like, yeah, I mean, Dad told us in the past, like, Kinpa's parents were both actually scientists and they died in an accident somewhere, right? But as they're sitting around talking about Kinpa's past, Kinpa suddenly yells over for Hibaru, and Hibaru comes running towards her, and we see that he's like, whoa, what is that in front of you? As they go and look in front of him, and there is a massive hole blasted through the walls of this factory, right? And they're like, whoa, the hole got blown out, like, what's going on here? But Kinpa makes the observation, like, hey, this power, we've seen it before. It is Shio's Astro, right? So they're like, alright, so Shio was here then at some point, but, like, why was Shio coming here? Like, if he used his Astro here, that means he came here after the disaster occurred. But why did Shio end up coming here, right? And Hibaru's pretty much thinking through all this, like, hey, we gotta think about this, like, rationally. Like, all of the planet ducks gather into this room in here, and we pretty much see that they all pretty much collide to this one big machine in the middle. And as they walk towards it, there's a little bit of a hole, or a little bit of a pedestal with a little hole that is, of course, meant to hold an object somewhere, right? And Hibaru's like, what is this hole? It looks like something was removed here. Like what's going in here, right? We see that Tarasu's headed to a different area of the factory, though, or the plant. As we see, he's in some data analyzing room as he checks in the last access to the plant. As he pretty much yells down to Hibaru, like, hey, Hibaru, the last login to the plant system was really recent, and the history is still there, right? Ruri asks, like, hey, when was that last login? Like, when was the plant list accessed? And Habaru says, hey, 2 weeks ago at 4:40 p.m. in the afternoon, right? And hearing this, Ruri tells Habaru to move out of the way of this pedestal, sort of knowing that something is going on here, and says, hey, shatter time itself, retrograde missile. As we see that she pulls out a thing of lipstick, and all of a sudden it seems like the lipstick turns into a little bit of a missile, and this missile goes and fires right towards the pedestal where everything is going on. And Habaru is freaking out, like, Ruri, like, what are you doing? Why are you destroying this stuff? But it's not actually a deadly explosion. What it is something much different. As Ruri pretty much explains that she just blasted through time. She says that she is replaying the events from 2 weeks ago at 4:40 p.m. And as all of our characters look forward to what's going on here, we see that Shio and I'm pretty sure a brother whose name was Satsuki, if I'm not mistaken, walking up, or actually says Satsuki here, I'm sorry, I should have read a bit more, right? We see Shio and Satsuki walking up towards this plant and grabbing an object out of this pedestal, right? And it's something that they called the Daybreak Ore. Of course, the main mystery we have in Astro Royale right now is, what is this Daybreak Ore and why is it so important? Like, we don't quite know what it is yet, right? But we get a little bit of a hint here as all of a sudden Shio just says that he picks it up here in this sort of pass using the retrograde missile. Pretty much says like, hey, come to think of it, I can wipe out an entire city to ease with this thing, right? And pretty much all of the main cast, like, you're like, hey, that looks like just something that Satsuki had in Nisha Abuzubabel. Like, what is this actually going on here, right? And eventually, all of a sudden, Habaru looks over to Kimpa, as Kimpa just says, like, hey, I actually think I know what the Daybreak Ore is, right? And everybody's like, what are you talking about? And Kimpa just says, like, hey, both of my parents were researchers here at Plant Zero. And this is where we end off this chapter of Astro Royale. This chapter opens up a lot of really new and interesting questions for this series. Like, alright, we all thought that Kimpo was just Genji's daughter. While she is now, it seems like there's a little bit of an adoption thing going on there, and that her parents actually worked here at Plant Zero, and that she may have been born here and lived here for a little while, knowing this place from her nightmares. It's a really interesting little build-up that's going on here. Not to mention, I also like how we get a look at Ruri's power, which is the retrograde missile, which I really love the naming sort of conversation there, because of course, in college right now, I'm actually in an astronomy class, and I've recently learned what retrograde motion actually is, and that's when planets normally move westward in the sky, but at some point they start moving back eastward. It's sort of like a little bit of loop in time, almost as it looks like things are going backwards. So very cool little use of Ruri's power here of like, hey, retrograde missile. And of course it makes sense why she is a lawyer, because she can use this Astro now to see back into the past. A little bit of a cool ideas going on here, and I'm really liking what this Astro Royale chapter sort of brought up for the series. I did really like this chapter. Next up is Hima-Ten chapter number 11. This chapter is titled Himari's Protege. And that is really all we need to know about the start of this chapter, because it really does not rely on anything else that we've gotten the recent few chapters of Hima-Ten so far. It's really just about introducing a new character into the main cast of Hima-Ten as we know it, right? Well, we start off this chapter with both Yoshino and Iomori inside of their school building, pretty much talking to each other about some stuff going on. And pretty much Yoshino brings up to Iomori pretty much like, hey, so there's a younger girl from my agency coming into town. She's from the countryside, but she's pretty much going to be staying with me for tonight, right? And she also pretty much explains that because she models on occasion, she's part of an agency, and this is just a younger girl from said agency, right? But pretty much, Iomori's like, hey, but isn't tonight when I'm supposed to clean for you? And Yoshino pretty much just says, like, hey, this girl will be over to my place at 8, so make sure you finish all of the cleaning before then. And I'm also going to be late because of work, so you need to also make dinner, and make enough dinner for 2 people, of course, me and this other person, right? Very simple plot getting to start off this chapter with it. And pretty much Iomori's like, all right, sounds good, I'll get it done. And he has a little bit of a notice of just thinking like, hey, ever since my first payday there, it feels like Yoshino's been acknowledging my skills even more, now pretty much giving me all of these instructions and just expecting me to do it and not sort of like holding back anything like she would have done before, right? But we now cut to Iemori on the train, of course heading over to Yoshino's place to start doing all of his cleaning duties. And while he's on the train, there's a little bit of a thing going on where there's an older woman who is standing up on the train, and a younger girl, of course, offers, like, hey, you can, of course, take my seat, madam, like, don't worry about it, like, I'm young and I can surprise, so I can stand up doing all of this, right? And Yoshino pretty much just sees all of this happen, or no, I'm not Yoshino, I'm sorry, Iemori pretty much sees all of this happen, sees this person sit down, and pretty much just gets a good look at this person who is, of course, just gave up their seat on the train, right? He pretty much just makes a note of like, hey, she's got dyed blonde hair and looks dressed up, but she seems to be a very nice girl, right? And as all of this happens, they both end up getting off at the same exact stop, right? And as they get up, and as they get off of the train there, this girl pretty much just says like, man, I did such a good thing back there, maybe the universe will reward me, right? And hearing this, Iemori's like, okay, this person is obviously crazy, I will just pretend I didn't hear that, right? As all of a sudden, we see this girl turns around all of a sudden, and all of a sudden the train just starts moving, and she's just like, wait, no, stop the train, I left something on there, right? And pretty much she just explains like, man, I messed up so bad, like, what do I do now? Of course, being a great guy, Iemori comes over, is like, hey, miss, you forgot your luggage back there, because of course she goes running away from the platform without her bag and everything, right? And she's like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, thank you for bringing it to me. And she just explains like, hey, whenever I focus on something, I lose track of everything else, right? And Iemori's like, so did you forget your things on the luggage rack back there or something? And she pretty much explains that she accidentally left her phone, wallet, and travel IC card. They were all in her bag, so she really messed up back there, right? And Iemori's like, how can somebody like legitimately mess up this bad here? As this girl pretty much explains that she is actually not from Tokyo, so she's like, hey, what do people normally do whenever this sort of like thing happens? Like, is this something normal that actually happens to people? And Iemori pretty much explains like, hey, luckily you're on the line, and if you tell the station and staff all that stuff, they should be able to go on to the train and get all of your luggage and everything back as long as nobody takes it or anything, right? And the girl's pretty much just like, man, I'm so done for, but I tried doing something good earlier, so why did the universe punish me all of a sudden, right? And pretty much she explains that she's on a way to a certain gig at some point, and she's like, hey, I don't know if I'm going to make it in time, it's so soon going on around here. And Iemori is like, hey, so are you more worried about your work or your actual things, right? And the girl pretty much explains like, hey, I've only got one job, so that's sort of more important to me right now. And it's like, if I just had the IC card, the rest wouldn't actually matter, right? And of course, being a really nice guy, Iemori actually offers to pay for her train fare just this one time due to the like excruciating circumstances, right? And the girl pretty much like, hey, are you like hitting on me or something? But Iemori's just like, no, I'm not at all. I'm just trying to do a good thing here. He's like, you can tell all of the staff about your lost bag and all of that, and then just get out of the station by paying like the highest fare, like a lost train ticket or something, right? And Iemori just explains like, hey, I was there when you did a good deed, so I can sort of reward you in this sort of way. I can spare you 1,000 yen. And as we went to earlier, what is the USD to yen? What is that looking like right now? Let's see what 1,000 yen is. It is 675 in the current economy right now. So, all right, look at that. I guess he's sparing pretty much $7 for this train ticket, which is arguably not that expensive. Sort of is what it is there. But then this girl pretty much just says like, hey, well, if you're going to be doing that for me, can I ask you for something else, right? As she pretty much just like explains to Iemori that she wants him to come with her to her agency so she can get back the money and they'll all pretty much be equal, so there'll be no problem. If she can just get money to pay back for her manager, she'll just have it taken out of her check pretty much, right? As we pretty much understand that her name is Kana Aizawa. Of course, this is Kana sort of drawn out like Kana, pretty much just like, or Ka-na, if that na sounds sort of like, or the N in the na sort of being drawn out a little bit. But we pretty much learned this is Kana Aizawa, which doesn't help that we already have a character named like Kanai and now Kana. that doesn't work too well for my brain. Like, how am I supposed to remember all these different character names when they all start with the same letter almost? Like, come on here. Like, what are you doing to me, right? And she pretty much just explains, like, hey, I'm an up-and-coming talent making my debut here, or making my debut here soon. I don't know why I couldn't say that word. And Imouri's like, hey, so why is your gig so important to you here, right? And the two of them just, like, talk a little bit. We pretty much learned that Kana is about a year younger than Iomori is, right? And Iomori is a second-year high schooler, while she is a first-year high schooler, right? A few jokes were made at all of this expense so far, and as they're pretty much just talking, Iomori pretty much eventually asks Kana, like, hey, what is your gig going on today, right? And she says, like, well, normally I do all sorts of things. I'm really trying out a bunch of stuff right now, but my work today is a secret. And Iomori is like, well, I'm a little curious hearing all of this, right? And eventually Kana's like, hey, I see the building over there, Iomori. I'm going to make it in time. Thank you so very much. And she walks in. She's like, hey, I'm going to go in and get the money, so just please wait out here for a second. I'll come and pay you back, all of this. Iomori's like, all right, sounds good. And eventually Kana goes in and comes back out and pays back Iomori the 1,000 yen that he lent her earlier and all of that. And Iomori's like, hey, don't worry about it. Actually, I just got a call from the station, and they said they found all of your stuff. I'm like, hey, it worked out, so your good deed didn't leave you into negative in the very end, right? And Kana's like, hey, actually, since I met you, I think this was a net positive in the end. Like, also, you seemed interested in knowing about my job. So, this is the first magazine I was in. You can have it. She sort of holds out the first modeling magazine she was in. And, of course, it is a Gravore magazine, pretty much, right? And Iomori is a little shocked by this. Is like, I don't know if I can have this. Like, you're a first-year student and all of that. But pretty much Kana just says, like, hey, I'm just trying to get my foot in the door now. Like, I got to use all my assets, and I'm proud of what I do. So Iomori's like, okay then, as she just goes into her agency to go do whatever she's going to do. And Iomori just heads off to, of course, his job, right? And in this last little confrontation here, Kana just says to Iomori, like, hey, names are the one thing I don't forget, and cheer me on, Iomori. I get the feeling we'll meet again soon. And that is sort of where we end off this scene, as we see that later, of course, Yoshino is heading back to her house, as she's on the phone with a person, none other than, of course, Kana. Who could have expected this twist going on? And she pretty much explains, like, hey, a nice guy helped me out earlier today, right? And Yoshino's like, a nice guy, like, what are you talking about? Kana just says, like, yeah, and he was kind of my type too, like, it was really, really cool. So, eventually, Yoshino's like, alright, well, like I told you, I left a key at the front desk, you can let yourself in, but you can't get there earlier than we agreed, okay? 8 o'clock is the time. As we already hear that Kana is opening the door to the apartment, of course, and as she opens it up, who else is cleaning in there currently than, of course, Iomori, who is, of course, using the vacuum that we saw Yoshino and Iomori purchase a few chapters ago, right? And they turn to look at each other, and of course, while Yoshino is still on the phone, of course, Iomori is there, and pretty much, Kana's like, hey, well, Kana asks Yoshino, like, hey, who is that? You didn't say that, you had the, thing from earlier, right? And she eventually says, like, hey, so you know the guy who I said was my type earlier? Well, he's looking really fine right now while cleaning your house, as, of course, everything's come to a head, so that is where we end off this chapter of Hima-Ten. I really like this chapter. I think it was really fun. We get a new character introduced into the series, so next chapter is going to be pretty interesting to see what the fallout of all of this stuff is going on here right now, but I thought this was a pretty fun chapter, all things considered. Well, next up is Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi, chapter number 13. This chapter is titled Battling in Memento Forest. So, pretty much as I've done before, today we're going to bring back the speed round, of course, the Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi speed round as it's known now. To pretty much try to save a little bit of time in this video, we're going to speed through Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi as fast as I humanly can, while trying to get through all of the details going on in this chapter. So let me quickly take a drink of water, and then we'll start the speed round. Of course, my goal is try to get this done in under 4 minutes while still keeping all of the main detail here, but we will see how it works. So let me grab a drink of water, and then we'll start. Alright, so we start off this chapter of Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi, of course, with Kiyoshi, Sosuke, and of course the other guy who is with them for this test, of course, who is Zanki Tosaka. If you guys do not remember his name, I'll refer to him as Tozaka for the duration of this chapter. We see the three of them are all facing down this massive spider, and pretty much Tozaka's like, hey, we can't beat that thing, like, everybody needs to fall back. But of course, we've got two ultimately strong exorcists here, and of course, Kiyoshi uses his Moonrise Kingdom Artemis, and we see that Sosuke uses an Aqua Gun 90-gallon bullet to completely decimate this creature here. Sosuke pretty much, like, freaks out, like, man, these two are incredibly strong, right? So we pretty much see that all of these people start moving through the forest. Kiyoshi pretty much takes a note that Sosuke's precept power has increased dramatically, like he has grown in such a short time, and pretty much Kiyoshi just has like that friendly rivalry thing of like, hey, I won't let him beat me, right? So all the three of them like start to get moving, and pretty much they all start moving in a certain direction. Tozaka pretty much points out like, hey, are we even going the right way? And we see that both Sosuke and Kiyoshi think like, hey, I just started walking in a direction like I was just trying to act as cool as I could, right? But Tozaka pretty much explains like, hey, we only have an hour, so we don't have too much time to get lost. Pretty much two of them just say like, hey, with wisdom comes with age, of course, so we understand why you're the smartest here, so just, like, lead us around here, right? Tozaka pretty much then just says, like, hey, the three of us are in this together, so let's use teamwork to get out of this. And he says, like, hey, you guys should save your strength. As your senior, I should be doing my part, too. He says, I may be old, but I'm still a Class 1 Exorcist. As he summons his partner, Cook, the Exorcist bird, as we pretty much see this chicken who has, like, the, little hair on its head, like, shaped like a cross, is wearing sneakers and has sort of a pentagram drawn on its chest there, right? The two of them are all sort of like talking like, hey, this is a little weird, and we pretty much see that Cook is a little bit of an interesting chicken, almost pretty much like a dog in the end of the day, right? But Tozaka pretty much, calls on to Cook and says like, hey, Cook, go find a red sanctuary for us, right? And we see there's a little joke where the chicken barks a little bit, so we're like, man, it is a dog, all things considered, right? We cut a little bit forward in time where our key team is like moving around a forest, sort of just doing all of their various different things. We learned that Sosuke uses a water pistol, and we pretty much learned that his exorcist technique is to convert air moisture around him into holy water and then load it into his gun as an attack. A pretty cool effect, if I have to say so myself, and he pretty much also explains like, hey, as long as the air isn't completely dry, he has infinite ammo, so a pretty cool ability, all things considered. Pretty much as they just go through, Tozaka pretty much thinks about his first time taking the test and how the first time he was ever doing it, he actually got saved by Mr. Sasaki. And Kiyoshi thinks about this as like, oh, 10 years ago, that may have been Sasaki. So he sort of just like puts two and two together here. And as they're sort of just talking a little bit, Sosuke eventually brings up the point, like, hey, to not have given up after going through something like that on your first try, you're a bit of a weird guy, aren't you, Mr. Tozaka? Like, hey, that third weight, Funky said you've taken this test for 10 whole years now. What is it that keeps you going, right? And Tozaka pretty much explains, or Tosaka explains, like, hey, it's a bit of a cliche, but my very best friend was killed by a demon lord. It's like, you know, Grand Crosses are permitted to take on expeditions into the demon realm. Well, I want to go and exorcise that demon lord. My best friend was a great guy. He grew up in the country, and if he hadn't been killed by a demon lord, he would have moved back with his parents to keep his hometown to be the head of his hometown's Exorcist Association branch office. I had no real drive or ambition as an exorcist, yet he's the one who died, and there's no way I can rest until I have avenged him, right? And both Kiyoshi and Sosuke are pretty much thinking like, man, we are going to pass, like, that's such a good story you have there, right? And like, Kiyoshi's like, I'm going to do whatever I can to help you through all of this, right? And pretty much Sosuke says, like, hey, what are you crying for, Kiyoshi? Like, it's such a common story. So, like, now let's get out of here. But we see on the other side of his face, Sosuke's also crying after hearing this story, right? Pretty much says, like, so are you guys not going to, like, laugh at me or anything? And both Kiyoshi and Sosuke turn around like, hey, what is there to laugh at, right? Of course, like, acknowledging Tozaka for who he is as a person, right? Well, then Cook and Tozaka start to run ahead and from the pack, as all of a sudden, Tozaka sort of starts to fly up into the air, as all of a sudden, we see that some sort of exorcist power has been used to draw him somewhere else, as all of a sudden, we see that Tozaka is now on the ground somewhere, and standing in front of him is no other person than Yana, who pretty much just says, like, hey, naturally going after you is the logical thing to do. If I take you out, then those two rookies are finished. Of course, since they don't want Kiyoshi or Sosuke to pass. Whew, that is the Mama Yu speed round, or it was the Mama Yu speed round, now it is the Ultimate Excess Kiyoshi speed round. Good chapter of Ultimate Excess Kiyoshi. I really like seeing more of the character of Tozaka. I'm really interested to see what he is in the future, and I really like the moment where neither Kiyoshi or Sosuke sort of laugh at Tozaka's whole thing. It's a little bit of like a cool idea of like, hey, other people may laugh at you, but you are in this for a good reason, so why should we care? A really cool little thing going on there. The next chapter up is, of course, Akane-banashi, chapter number 127. This chapter is titled Impossible Task. We pretty much open up with Akane in her bed, as we pretty much see it is currently 6:30 in the morning, her alarm goes off, and we pretty much see that Akane has not slept at all, of course, after her conversation yesterday with Shiguma. And we pretty much see that Akane's like, yeah, my head is all jumbled up due to everything that happened back there. As we see that she honestly can't rationalize around anything that has gone on in the past, right? And there's a little bit of a joke here where pretty much she explains it to herself in the guise of Rakugo Quest, which is, of course, a spin-off of Dragon Quest. And we even see that as the characters go on, we see that even Akane is dressed as like the main character of one of the Dragon Quest games. A little bit of a funny joke going on there. But eventually Akane's like, hey, I need to get out of bed and like get on with my day, as she just imagines that Karashi is the one narrating this sort of Rakugo Quest story. It's a little bit of a funny joke there, and we see that even Karashi's just like playing video games after being all up after an all-nighter, right? But pretty much after she gets up in the morning, she just thinks like, hey, I can tell that Shiguma waited for the right moment to tell me, because he knew I would get like this even after all this time of being a Rakugoka. And she's like, yes, I am determined. I'm going to learn that story. It's just so weird. Like, I feel off in a massive way, right? But as all of this is going on, she eventually gets a text from Mikeru, and Mikeru pretty much just says like, hey, how are you doing, Akane? Like, are you free today? You want to hang out with the boys for a day of summer, right? As she eventually goes to the Shiguma house, where of course all of the other Shiguma pupils are, and we pretty much see that Mikeru is getting it all set up for like a summer festival sort of looking thing of some type, right? And he pretty much explains like, hey, I've been doing all of these jobs this entire summer, and I came to a realization, like, I haven't done anything summerly all year. So when I was doing some stuff earlier, I said, hey, let's do some summer type stuff. And we see there's this weird contraption made to pretty much float soma noodles down the middle of it so people could eat of it. We see that Koguma's there, who's pretty much engineered this entire thing, and that the person who has been cooking all of the noodles is none other than Koji, of course, right? And there pretty much there's a bunch of small jokes going on with all of this, and we also see that Giriko is talking to all of them through the phone, right? And that he shipped over all of the noodles that they are currently eating, right? And it eventually gets brought up the whole point of that she was the opening act for Master Shiguma's show, and they're like, so how did it go? Pretty much Giriko says like, hey, now you're a real member of the Shiguma school now that you've done this. Koji's like, yeah, I remember my time at it. Koji's just like, yeah, I remember, I can look back on it now. And Mikeru's like, yeah, I mean, it was always a fun time back in the day, right? But pretty much Giriko just says like, hey, he puts up everybody to an impossible task right after their Futatsumi confirmation. Koji's like, yeah, mine was to not make people laugh as my task for the event. Koguma then explains that his impossible task was to dig up a story out of nowhere and pretty much present it and everything. Giriko pretty much starts to give his impossible task, but the signal gets so bad and everything, right? But pretty much Mikeru explains like, hey, basically everybody's had to do something crazy difficult in the past, so you'll be fine no matter what happens. He says, Master only says what he believes that we can do as pupils, right? Akane hears all of this and just like sort of rationalizes it in his head and all of that sort of deal, as Mikeru pretty much is just like, hey, he always likes to talk big when it comes to big important moments, but of course he usually doesn't talk enough. He's like, he tries to act all humble, but he'd rather speak through actions, not words. And at this point, Shiguma appears behind him and just says like, hey, well, excuse me for trying to speaking in that way, right? pretty much all of the other students just laugh a little bit as everything goes on, and everyone's like, oh, hey, Master Shiguma's here now, right? Shiguma and Akane sit down on the bench as Shiguma's like, hey, so are you not hungry after today? And she's like, no, I really haven't had much of an appetite at all. And Shiguma's like, oh, I see. And Akane just says like, hey, what you said to me yesterday, you were trying to give me a little advanced warning since it's a story that has a complicated background, right? And Shiguma's like, I mean, you are correct there, right? And Shiguma says like, yeah, would be correct in thinking that. And Akane just says like, hey, why are you tiptoeing around this whole situation? And she's like, hey, I don't need to hear a bunch of convoluted drama. I'm not really going to understand it. Just say I trust you and just say follow along. Like, you don't have to turn this into a whole formal test of character. What I'm saying is the loincloth of my heart is already tightened. And Shiguma just like laughs a little bit, just like, you talk for all of that. Then I'll leave that story with you, Akane, right? And Akane's like, you got it. It is in good hands. And as she sort of stands up after all of this, her stomach starts to rumble as both her and Shiguma get over to the massive contraption that all the other Shiguma students have built. And as they start eating all of that, Akane just thinks to herself, tonight, I'm going to sleep like a rock. And that's where we end off this chapter of Akane-banashi. This definitely wasn't my favorite chapter of Akane-banashi. I think it was alright, but it's sort of like one of those middling chapters where, yeah, a bunch of cool stuff is happening. We're sort of getting built up to the whole idea of Akane is going to be learning the Shiguma's art story that has been such a big deal since the beginning of the series. But, of course, she's not quite ready for it, and she becomes more ready for it by the end of this chapter. A nice little progression, but I'm sure that we'll be starting on a more major arc here soon, as this is sort of like an intermediate chapter after all of this long, big arc that we just had in Akane-banashi. Next up is Blue Box, chapter number 165. This chapter is titled The Haunted House. And this chapter, of course, is dealing with the whole haunted house that is going on during Class 2B's haunted house experience during the school festival. We, of course, see that Kyo is the main leader of this operation of pretty much the entire sort of class thing. And a bunch of the students note, like, hey, Kyo's a hot mess. Like, when we're done, we need to treat him to something good to eat since he's pretty much running this entire operation here right now. We see that two people enter the haunted house and pretty much go through all of the scares. Of course, it is narrated by, of course, Hina. And, of course, as everything goes on, we eventually see Taiki jump out as we see that he's got the costume of an axe on his head and some fake blood running down his face, right? And we see the two people who ended up entering the haunted house is none other than, of course, Chinatsu and, of course, her friend Nagisa, as the two of them come in and, they see pretty much Taiki, and they pretty much talk to each other like, hey, don't freak us out like that, a few little funny jokes going on here. And eventually Chinatsu's like, hey, Taiki, when we get to walk around later, I want you to wear that funny-looking outfit, right? And Taiki's like, hey, I don't know how I feel about walking around school with fake blood running down my face, but it's whatever, right? Pretty much they start to leave the haunted house, and we cut to another scene, which is, of course, where Hina is inside, taking a break from her duties of pretty much narrating the entire experience, as she pretty much is showing a waiver to everybody who goes in, like, hey, it's not our fault if you get scared, like, it sort of is what it is. Like, hey, please read this over, and who would enter the door right now? Of course, Yusa and one of her friends, right? Yusa and Hina have a little bit of a conversation going on here, right? And pretty much the whole end of this is pretty much Yusa just saying, like, hey, whenever I talk to you, I start to see things from a new angle. I mean, it's like, hey, I appreciate that. Between yesterday and my test, like, that's everything going on here, right? And Hina pretty much says, like, hey, that's the privilege of being an upperclassman. I can help you out right that. But we pretty much see that Yusa and Yusa's friend go into the haunted house to get a little bit scared while things are going on. We now cut to another scene, of course, dealing with Kyo this time, as one of the members of the classroom is like, hey, my flashlight's batteries died a bit earlier, and Kyo's like, all right, here's some new ones, and as he's pretty much taking care of all of the people here in the class, all of a sudden, some random person comes in and just says, like, hey, I need a person in charge of all of this to sign this waiver right here, right? And of course, the person in charge is Kyo. So Kyo comes over and just signed a paper. And he pretty much signs it and gets everything taken care of, as another one of the members of the class comes out and is like, hey, Fujiwara's on the next shift and he's not here yet, like, we need to get him here so we can deal with some stuff. And apparently he's with one of the first years, and like, what is he doing? We need him here so we can do some of the haunted house stuff, because we're not going to have enough manpower if he's not here. So hearing this, Kyo, of course, being the leader, runs out to go try to find where Fujiwara is. But as he's walking around, he's like, I've tried to set up everything up beforehand so I can take some breaks and relax while this is going on. I've been running around almost non-stop since this entire thing started. He's like, I've almost got to find a chance to rest during all of this, right? But as he's moving around, he finally bumps into Ayame, who of course is promoting the pretty much haunted house that Kyo's class is pointing on, right? And Ayame's like, hey, Kyo, what are you doing? Like, what's the hurry going on here? And actually, Kyo does not actually recognize Ayame, because Ayame has her hair down, something that she normally doesn't do, to sort of look more ghostly-like, right? As Ayame pretty much explains, like, yeah, my powers of transformation are awesome, like, doesn't it give you a Sadako look, right? But Kyo says, like, no, I actually like the usual one you better, right? And Ayame's like, why is that? And pretty much Kyo explains, like, hey, because you look a lot more like your older sister right now, right? But pretty much they get back to the topic at hand, like, hey, why are you in a hurry anyway? And Kyo pretty much explains, like, hey, I'm looking for this person. And Ayame's like, wait, he's running late? Well, damn it, I'll find him, I'll give him a good talking to, right? We pretty much see that Ayame gives a few of her grievances at Fujiwara during all of this time going on, right? And while she's walking around doing all of this, she starts to promote Class 2B's haunted house some more, right? And Kyo makes a little bit of a joke of, hey, this is not exactly Sadako's vibe going on here, right? The two of them get into a little bit of some fun banter and everything coming on, and eventually, as they're sort of walking around and making some jokes, a little boy in a soccer t-shirt sort of runs up and says, like, hey, that's Sadako there, and it's like, 2B's holding a haunted house, right? And this little kid's like, hey, there's no such things as ghosts, right? And like, hey, I'm sure that hair is just a wig, as this little kid goes to try to pull on Ayame's hair. But before this kid can go and do that, Kyo pretty much blocks this kid off. So like, hey, you shouldn't go touching girls' hair without permission, all that sort of stuff going on. The little kid's parents come over and sort of like scold the kid a little bit, and pretty much just get to like, hey, it's okay, just be more careful in the future after all of this. Ayame gives a little bit of a smile seeing what Kyo just did for, and all of a sudden Fujiwara sort of like comes walking out of a building. Ayame pretty much puts down some wrath and like puts a curse on Fujiwara almost, and pretty much Fujiwara goes off and goes to the haunted house as all of this goes on, right? But of course, hearing this, that Fujiwara just got told it's his fault, Fujiwara just says to Kyo, like, hey, you don't really see it, but Ayame is, like, particularly scary, but, like, you don't notice it because it always looks like you're enjoying yourself when you're with her, Kyo. I wonder what this means, and I wonder what could happen next in this series. Oh, wait, Saki is here at this event and ends up seeing Kyo somewhere, right? And, of course, she sees Kyo and goes sort of follow him, and she's like, oh, hey, Kyo, how are you doing, right? And Kyo's like, oh, hey, Saki, are you alone here? And Saki's like, no, I'm with some friends. And by that, she's like, by that, I mean, like, girlfriends. Like, I only have girlfriends. Trying, like, to push this idea on the Kyo. And eventually, Saki just says, like, hey, listen, Kyo, I know what I said before, but my ex is really persistent in everything going on. And, like, I've been thinking about how he might show up at my place once again. And it really freaks me out, right? So, but whenever I'm with you, I feel so relaxed. Like, I want you to protect me and be by my side. And of course, as she sort of says this, we cut over to where Ayame is, and of course, Ayame meets up with Takasako randomly. Of course, Takasako is the guy who asked out Ayame again a few chapters ago. And we pretty much see there's a little bit of flirting going on between the two of them, as Takasako's like, oh, hey, Ayame, I didn't recognize you there for a second, right? And Ayame just says, like, yeah, I know my powers of transformation are a little shocking. But Tasasako just says, like, yep, you're cute no matter what you look like. Just a little bit of stuff going on there. And this is where we end off this chapter of Blue Box. This is a very good chapter. I enjoy what we get here. We get a little few moments to get... We get moments between all the sort of relationships forming in this series. Of course, Chinatsu and Taiki, Yusa and Hina. We also see, of course, the stuff between Kyo and Ayame, and of course, then Kyo and Saki, and of course, Ayame and Tasasago. Very interesting stuff going on here, and I'll be interested to see where we go next time in Blue Box. Next up is the Elusive Samurai, chapter number 173. This chapter is titled Stormbringer 1338. So this chapter starts off, of course, with Lord Chikafusa, of course, Akie's father, commanding around all of the elusive warriors. We see that he's pretty much commanding Tokiyuki. We also see that Kojiro and Ayako are all here, and we see that they are pretty much all building a ship for Lord Chikafusa. We get some explanation that the Elusive Samurai is great at, pretty much explaining the whole military state of the world right now. Pretty much narration just is given. 4 months after Akie's death, Tokiyuki was in Kitapadake territory in Ise. Ever since Akie's expedition, the enemy has blocked routes to the east, so the Chikafusa people are going to bypass them by sea. As we pretty much get an explanation that the combined forces of the Hojo army and the Chikafusa army are going to land in Oshu and Kanto simultaneously and swiftly suppress the enemy's weakened forces. Akinobu, who is of course Kitapadake, Akinoyu, who is Akie's younger brother, will go with Date and Yuki to northern Oshu, Kasuga and Chikafusa will go to southern Oshu, and Nita and the Hojo clan will go to Kanto. And that is pretty much our explanation for where all of these characters are going in the next sort of arc of Elusive Samurai, where all of these characters are heading next, pretty much, right? All of the brutes that were part of Akie's army are pretty much like, yes, we can go home and we can get new lands, like it's a bold plan, almost if we never lost that last battle. They were pretty much making up for lost time almost immediately. At this point, Yuki appears. Of course, Yuki is the big, brute, brazen guy who has, like, that very simple, like, face, but is, like, that mass murderer on the inside. He pretty much returns, and he has 6 heads in pretty much a bucket right here. He says, I present a selection of severed heads here. Tokiyuki asked, like, Lord Chikafusa, like, hey, what is going on here? And Chikafusa pretty much explains, like, hey, Yuki wanted to kill some people, so I allowed him to execute captured criminals and bandits. Now all the no-good doers have disappeared from Issei, right? And pretty much we just get the explanation here that from Kojiro, like, yeah, so Chikafusa was really able to use Yuki's, like, murderous instincts for something good. Like, that's very interesting, right? We then see that Chikafusa is also training all of the brutes that Akie had in the army, pretty much teaching all of them about shipbuilding, pretty much saying like, hey, you guys are going to be studying shipbuilding, study all day and at night. You men don't understand history either, so I'm going to drill it into you. And he also includes Tokiyuki and many of the elusive warriors in this teaching about the ways of the world, right? Tokiyuki pretty much thinks like, hey, he's a demanding teacher just like his son. And the Southern Court was at a disadvantage despite his son's death, but Kitapadake Chikafusa lent unyielding support and strategized for war throughout the entire land, right? There's a little bit of a thing between Ayako and Shizuku, as Ayako pretty much asks, like, hey, Shizuku, like, I didn't have time to ask you before, but even though you are a goddess, you're still our friend and fellow retainer, right? Like, nothing's going to change between us. And Shizuku's like, hey, I'd curse you if I weren't a goddess or anything, right? And then there's a little bit of a funny joke where, like, Kojiro comes over like, hey, would peeing on a holy tree, like, invoke any sort of divine punishment, right? We see that Natsu also asks, like, hey, Earth finding and keeping a wallet, like, is that, like, looked down upon? We see that, this sword girl leg. Sheena also bucks in and asks, like, hey, or actually, like, farting while, like, fighting, like, is that okay? And then Ginba comes in just saying, like, yeah, or if my, fart accidentally farted when your clothes got cut and, like, the way you're going in, but, like, there's a whole bunch of, like, stuff just going on here, like, and Ginba just makes it so stupidly funny, right? And Shizuku just makes it, like, oh, they're all confessing my sins to me, and she says, it's almost all fleet. A little bit of a funny joke there, and I really like how, like, Kojiro brings it up, like, normally, like, hey, would peeing on a holy tree, like, evoke any divine punishment? I think it's a pretty funny joke, right? But Tokiyuki just makes a little note, like, but then Shizuku just makes a little note, like, hey, as a deity, I have an ominous premonitions about this next battle, right? we eventually see that all of these ships and everything have been built, and all of the various factions are getting ready to head out into the world. We see all of the various brutes be like, alright, we're all going to be returning to Osu alive, I hope no one stole our fields. And pretty much the brutes are just saying like, hey, Akie-sama, I will study more and spread the seeds of what you taught us. As we see that many of these brutes are also carrying around studying materials and scrolls of general knowledge with them for the general future, so they can learn how to do different various things and become smarter after Akie's death. I sort of like that a little bit, right? There's a little note between Lord Katsuga and also Date. We pretty much see that they are going to be going in different directions, being that they are now no longer part of Akie's general army. Yeah, they're going to be splitting up. Eventually, we see that everybody hops onto the boats and gets ready to go to sea. We see that Nita is not very, accustomed to this. Nita's pretty much barfing over the side of the ship, and Natsu is scolding them a little bit. But as all of this is going on, we eventually see that Yuki's ship is right next to the one that is heading towards Kanto, of course, with all the elusive warriors and Nita. And pretty much Tokiyuki goes out and says like, hey Yuki Dono, I have some parting words for you. Can you stop your senseless killing? Like, you're loyal, you're kind to all of your fellow retainers, so I cannot completely condemn you, but only if you weren't such a killer, you'd be a greater person. But Yuki pretty much just says like, hey, Tokiyuki Dono, I cannot deny my nature. In times of peace, I'm just a mass murderer. But since we're at war and I had a good general, history will label me as a loyal retainer. So I will go to hell with gratitude. Tokiyuki just pretty much listens on to this as Yuki pretty much disappears. And there's not really any notice if this is at a later point or if this is just after Tokiyuki has said these words to Yuki. But all of a sudden, some wind starts blowing up in the sea, as pretty much we get a little bit of narration just going like, hey, shortly after setting sail, a storm befell the Southern Court's fleet, almost as if it was targeting it, right? And we see the person who is causing these winds is none other than Mima, of course, the person who all of the people met in Kyo all so long ago. I think it was like 120 chapters ago at this point. So it seems like Mima is finally going to have a big impact on the Elusive Samurai story. Shizuku sees it as Mima's doing and just thinks like, oh, what has happened to you, Mima? Your power has grown in such a short time. No human force could withstand you, but if I use divine power, then my very existence will disappear. So it's a question of, okay, what's Shizuku going to do here? She's going to attack Mima and possibly sacrifice herself, or are they going to have to deal with Mima in a different way? A little bit of an interesting idea here going forward, and yeah, I'm sort of excited to see Mima back in a series. She's got a different design here than she ever did before. I was sort of hoping that she, if not anything, she'd become an ally to the Elusive Warriors and not like an enemy to them, but that's just how storytelling goes, and not everything that you expect actually happens, but I'll be sort of interested to see what happens next time between, of course, Shizuku and Mima, who have been pretty much set up to be like, yeah, these two are going to have to face off because they both have and use divine power at certain points, so I'm very excited for what's coming up next in Elusive Samurai. And the last chapter this week, in chapter number 16, is Witch Watch, chapter number 172. This chapter is titled, Dark, Dank, and Delicious, Devilishly Good Cooking. So yeah, this is a very sort of interesting chapter of Witch Watch, as this is a big gag chapter pretty much going through. Pretty much to sum up what this chapter is about and not spend like the entire time going over all of the little jokes and all the gags in this chapter. We see that Chami has come over to the Otigi house, and while she's over there, Morito just asks, like, hey, Chami, how's Nico's mental training going? Chami pretty much says, like, hey, great, can't you tell by looking at her? And we can tell that Nico has grown up a little bit from learning and doing her mental training, because the whole thing is like, hey, whenever she caught butterflies, she wouldn't always grow, and that's because she did not know how to use that magic. But doing her mental training, she's learning more about magic and is able to grow to the point where she once was. So of course, Nico is a witch of thousands, so she needs to have and know thousands of spells to get back to the point where she once was as a regular teenage girl, pretty much, right? Pretty much as time goes on, eventually a cooking show comes on television, right? And Nico says, oh my gosh, it's almost time for a Kirara's super sparkly cooking show, like here's what it is, right? And everybody's like, are you like sure she's growing up? Like she still loves watching all of these cooking shows, right? Morito just says, like, hey, Nico's always been young at heart. What she likes hasn't really changed too much over the years. And, like, Hirara's cooking show is her current favorite show to watch on television. I hear it'll end so, though, and supposedly they are starting a new cooking series. And hearing this, Chami speaks up, is like, yeah, so about that, I'm actually going to be the star of the new series, right? All of the people in the Otogi house are just like, do you know how to cook? Like, are you able to do all of that sort of stuff? And the whole thing here is that it looks like Slump will end up possessing Chami to be able to do all of these things. Like, hey, by letting him possess her, Chami and Slump can merge together, and if Chami allows it, Slump can control her body. So Slump will take over for the actual cooking part since he knows how to do all of that, right? Now, the rest of the general chapter here is just about the first day of filming and the first episode of this new cooking show, right? Pretty much the whole premise of the cooking show is that Chami is a character. She's pretty much the whole premise of the show is that it's set in the netherworld, and as the producer pretty much explains, your character, Deadly Shaz, is a devil. You need to lean into a bunch of weird different things and pretty much obey whatever this devil tells you to cook, and then cook that as part of the cooking show. Chami does a little bit of a musical number, and pretty much the whole show, or pretty much the rest of the chapter, is about how ridiculous this show is, and then Chami also making a bit more of this even more ridiculous, being that she's also possessed by Slump and all the sort of weird jokes that come around it. It was a pretty good, like, funny comedy chapter, but nothing that totally was like, oh yeah, that was really, really great. Pretty much the end of the chapter then cuts back to everybody in the Otogi house watching the preview whenever this episode comes out. Chami is also there, being that she helps Nico with the mental training, right? Pretty much everybody banters like, yeah, that was a really free-form show, like, but it was pretty fun to watch, right? I love Konzo kind of like, you went kind of nuts there, Chami, right? And Chami just is like, hey, it was the show and my genie who are nuts, like, not me, right? And Chami's getting a little bit of down and dumps, like, hey, it was going to be great and all, but it ended up being like a total dumpster fire. Like, I thought I'd get more acting because of this, but it totally ruined my entire image as an actress that I worked so hard to build, right? But of course, Keigo, being chronically online at points, sort of says like, hey, actually you're kind of trending online right now, Chami, right? And Chami's like, huh? What are you talking about, right? But Slump pretty much says like, hey, it seems that fans really like seeing that side of Chami that ran so counter to her typical image, right? And then a little bit of narration just going in the end, like, hey, her ability to improvise on the spot with all of her witty comebacks and her toughness to completely whoop a scene and earned her praise from people in the industry. It didn't particularly help her acting career, but now she's constantly invited to be on variety shows, right? So at the end of the day, this entire show that was really weird and Chami didn't think she did a good job at actually ended up helping her in the end. And yeah, that's Witch Watch. I decently enjoyed this chapter. Yes, it's a gag chapter, so as funny as you find a gag is how far your mileage will vary with this chapter. But I thought some of the jokes were decently funny, and at the end of the day, it was a pretty funny chapter, all things considered. Oh, I am tired of talking. If you guys have not been able to tell, I've actually had to split this video up into about 5 different parts because my voice has been really, like, scratchy lately. So, like, it's been hard to, like, constantly churn all of this content out, and my throat after talking about 16 chapters is super, super tired. But with that, yeah, those are all the chapters this week. So that means it's now time to rank them from worst to best. What was the best chapter of the week, and what was indeed the worst chapter of the week. So let's move over to the Shonen Jump chapters spreadsheet, where of course I will be ranking all these chapters from worst to best here. So as you can see, we have all 16 chapters we talked about today. That's an incredible thing. I just reviewed 16 chapters. That's a stupid amount of chapters all to consider. So yeah. We have Jujutsu Kaisen, One Piece, Undead Unluck, Kagurabachi, Ruri Dragon, Kill Blue, Ichi the Witch, Shinobi Undercover, Hakutaku, Astro Royale, Hima-Ten, Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi, Akane-banashi, Blue Box, Elusive Samurai, and Witch Watch. I think the easiest way to start this off is pulling out all the chapters that weren't particularly the best this week and go ahead and putting them in the bottom tiers, right? I think this is going to have to be a JJK. With that, I think we're going to have to put a Kill Blue here, a Hakutaku, following it up, those are probably the worst 3 chapters this week, in my opinion. I think Kill Blue was the least enjoyable, as you can see in the spreadsheet, as it has been these past few weeks. Next up, I'm probably, let's remove Kill Blue from here, and let's remove it from here. I think next I'm gonna have to put, I honestly don't know. There's a lot of good chapters, but also a lot of very middling chapters too this week, so to a point where I don't quite know where to rank everything. I felt like One Piece was very enjoyable, but it wasn't like the highest tier of chapter. It'll probably go like somewhere around here, let's say. So One Piece. I really don't know. There's a lot of good chapters this week. Like, I'm really debating about it. Ichi the Witch, I did really enjoy that chapter. I don't know if it was the best Ichi the Witch, but it was definitely probably in that top 3 there. I also liked Astro Royale. Kimpa has some interesting stuff going on. Honestly, I think I'm going to put One Piece maybe as... Man, I'm really having a hard time debating on what I want to pick as the chapter of the week here. Kagurabachi was also really good. I think Kagurabachi has to go. I don't think it was the best chapter. So Kagurabachi, if I could spell. Sorry, my B-H-I. I had to move the phone out a little bit where I'm recording this on because I can't really move my hand on my keyboard as I normally would. Oh, chapter of the week? Yeah, it's Ruri Dragon. There's, like, nothing about that chapter that wasn't, like, pure gas and amazing. After One Piece, we'll probably put Astro Royale. I actually really enjoyed that chapter this week. Then Blue Box, as much as it's a train wreck and I want to see these characters get together, it's like, yeah, Saki coming in and like putting a monkey wrench in things did make me go like, damn it, Saki. So yeah, I've got to put that there. Next is probably Hima-Ten. If I could format it correctly. Hima-Ten, also a chapter that I did enjoy a good amount. Back to the bottom, I just think Hakutaku just wasn't particularly my thing this week. So let's remove all the chapters I've put down so far. So One Piece, Undead, no, I haven't put Undead Unluck down yet. Undead Unluck, Kagurabachi, Ruri Dragon, Ichi the Witch, Hakutaku, Astro Royale, Blue Box. So that leaves, I think, JJK, so Jujutsu Kaisen, Kaisen, as the next chapter here. Just wasn't really my thing this week. So that leaves us with Shinobi Undercover, Undead Unluck, Ultimate Exorcist, Kiyoshi, Akane-banashi, Elusive Samurai, and Witch Watch. So let's delete everything else here and decide where we're going to put all these chapters next. Honestly, while Akane-banashi was good, it wasn't my favorite chapter this week. So I think it's going to go right here. Akane-banashi. I really like Shinobi Undercover. Yeah, I think we're going to put it here. Shinobi Undercover. Yeah, I did enjoy that chapter a good amount this week. Next, we'll put Undead Unluck. A really good chapter, but I think there was a few things that were better than it this week. Sure, we'll put Old TXRO Kiyoshi next. Another very solid chapter, and that leaves us with Elusive Samurai and Witch Watch. I did like Witch Watch a bit better, so I thought that joke was pretty funny, but it wasn't good enough to bump it up to the top there. It leaves ELU, Elusive Samurai, for last there. Like I said, this is a pretty interesting week this week, all things so like Ruri Dragon up here, Kagurabachi, Ichi the Witch, Astro Royale, Blue Box, Hima-Ten. Those are like the top tier chapters we had. And then like Shinobi Undercover, Undead Unluck, all the way down to like Elusive Samurai were like, yeah, I enjoyed those. And then Jujutsu Kaisen, Hakutaku, and Kill Blue were like, yeah, Jujutsu Kaisen's ending next week. Hakutaku wasn't my thing, and Kill Blue, yeah, it was sort of just like alright. Like, no, it wasn't even alright. I didn't really enjoy Kill Blue, so I don't even know I'm trying to justify it here. But now we get to pick out the character of the week. And honestly, Ruri Dragon has some good characters. Kagurabachi, Samurai was really fun introduction this week. But I think I'm going to have to give it to Kana from Hima-Ten. So from Hima-Ten. Yeah, I enjoyed Kana's character. I always like a new character introduction, and why I think Samura was a really good pick this week. I was thinking that like Kinpo would have been a good pick, but I really enjoyed Kana's character from what we saw from it so far, so. Yeah, with that, let's get out of the thing here. So let's stop sharing the screen. All right. All of that is good. So yeah, thank you guys so very much for watching this video on Weekly Shonen Jump issue number 43 of 2024. I hope you guys had a good time. I know this was 16 chapters, and I know my quality of content probably like dipped at a certain point, but I hope here at the end it rose back up for it, because I know for the first time in recording this video, my throat actually feels okay during talking about these last 2 chapters here, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed all of this discussion of all of these manga chapters. Thank you guys so very much for watching this video on Weekly Shonen Jump issue number 43 of 2024. I talked about other Weekly Shonen Jump issues at certain points. The last one I talked about was issue number 40 exactly. And then I did a few about a year ago talking about a bunch of issues in 2023. Don't expect the next video in this series on the next issue number 44. It may be on that issue or it may not. We will just have to see if I enjoyed that issue of Jump enough to decide to talk about it. Yeah, but with that, thank you guys for watching. If you liked the video, hopefully mind subscribing down below. It's a little thing you can do to help me out. Leave a comment on what was your favorite chapter of the week and who is your MVP. And yeah, with that, thank you guys so very much for watching. I had a great time talking about Shonen Jump today, and I will catch you guys next time. This is Glowplasma 231, signing out.